The letter had said very little. That was the first thing Savannah Reed noticed about it, back when she'd read it the third time under the thin lamplight of her rented room in Kansas City. Most men who advertised for wives in the Gazette filled half a column, describing their land, their prospects, their intentions. Silas Boone had used 11 lines, blunt lines. The kind of man writes not because he lacks words, but because he's decided words are largely a waste of everyone's time. Rancher. Widower. 6 sons, ages 7 to 19. Ranch in western Nebraska Territory, settlement of Ash Hollow. Looking for a capable woman, not a delicate one. Must be willing to work. Not looking for romance, looking for partnership. Respond only if serious, no flourish, no apology for the abruptness. Not even a physical description of himself, which most men at least attempted, usually generously. Savannah had read it a 4th time, then folded it carefully and set it beside the cold cup of coffee she could no longer afford to replace. She had responded the next morning, not because the letter moved her, not because she was romantic about the West or starry-eyed about ranching or harboring any particular fantasy about Nebraska. She responded because she was 31 years old, widowed 14 months, and the rent on the room in Kansas City was 3 weeks overdue. Because the seamstress work had dried up the way things dry up when a woman is alone, and the city decides quietly that she is no longer interesting. Because she had sat in that room the night before, listening to rain hit the window, and understood with cold clarity that staying meant slowly disappearing. Leaving, at least, meant something. The stagecoach dropped her at the edge of Ash Hollow on a Tuesday afternoon in late September, and the first thing she thought was that someone had forgotten to finish building it. The town, if it deserved the name, was a straggling collection of structures that looked like they'd wandered in from different directions and simply stopped moving. A trading post, a feed store with a collapsed awning nobody had repaired, a saloon that seemed to be the only building with fresh paint, which told her most of what she needed to know about local priorities. A handful of wooden storefronts, some occupied, some hollow behind their windows. And beyond it all, stretching in every direction, the open land, vast and indifferent, and nothing like the Kansas City skyline she'd grown used to pressing herself against for a sense of scale. There were perhaps a dozen people visible on the main street, and every single one of them turned to look at her. She was used to being looked at. She was not, however, used to being looked at the way Ash Hollow looked at her, with that particular combination of pity and skepticism that she would come to understand was the town's default expression for anything new and possibly foolish. A woman in a brown dress with a faded apron stepped out of the trading post and studied Savannah the way a farmer studies incoming weather. She was older, thick-armed, with the kind of face that had once been pretty and had decided, somewhere along the way, that pretty was less useful than reliable. "You'll be the one Silas sent for," the woman said. It was not a question. Savannah Reed. She kept her voice even. She'd learned, in the months after Thomas died, that steadiness was a currency that spent better than almost anything else. "Nora Calhoun, I run the trading post." The woman's eyes moved over her with professional efficiency. "You're thinner than I expected." "Than you expected from what?" "From what a woman needs to be to survive out here." She said it without cruelty, but without softness either. "Silas's place is 3 miles east. He should have sent someone to fetch you. Knowing Silas, he probably figured the stagecoach would handle it." "I can walk 3 miles." Nora Calhoun looked at her bag, then at her shoes, city shoes, brown leather, already dusty, and then at her face. Something shifted slightly in her expression. Not warmth, exactly. More like the first faint suggestion of reassessment. "I'll have my boy run you out in the wagon," she said. "It's no trouble. And you'll want to arrive with your feet intact. Lord knows you'll need them." The Boone Ranch appeared over a low rise, and Savannah's first honest reaction was something she would not repeat to another living soul for a long time. It looked exhausted. Not ruined. Not quite. The main house was solid, built from good timber, with a deep porch and 2 chimneys. There was a large barn, a smaller outbuilding that might have been a smokehouse once, and a series of fencing that stretched toward the tree line. But all of it wore the same expression, if buildings could have expressions. The slumped, drained look of something that had been holding on longer than it expected to, and was no longer sure it could manage another winter. The grass around the house was long in patches and bare in others. One section of porch railing had broken and been replaced with a board that didn't quite match. The kitchen garden beside the house held a few straggly plants that had given up around the time everything else had. Nora's boy, 13, mostly silent, dropped her at the gate and turned the wagon around before she'd even reached for her bag. She stood there a moment. Then the front door opened and 6 boys came out. They did not come out the way children come out, tumbling, curious, loud. They came out in a line, oldest to youngest, with the particular stillness of people who have learned that new things in their lives have usually meant worse news, and who are waiting to confirm whether this is another such occasion. The oldest was tall, broad through the shoulders, with a jaw already hardening into the shape his father's had probably worn at 19. He had light brown hair and dark eyes that looked her over with a flatness she recognized as the specific armor of someone who'd had to be an adult for too long. The youngest, barely 7, stood at the end of the line gripping the shirt of the boy beside him. His hair needed cutting badly. He had a small scrape on his chin, still fresh. None of them said anything. Savannah picked up her bag and walked to the porch steps. "I'm Savannah Reed," she said. "I'm looking for Silas Boone." "He's in the barn." The oldest one. His voice came out flat but not hostile, but the flatness of someone choosing their words carefully. "He said to tell you to wait on the porch." She considered this for a moment. "What's your name?" He blinked. A small, involuntary motion, like the question had surprised him. "Colt." "And your brothers?" He pointed down the line with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had recited this many times. "Jace, Eli, Sam, Henry, Emmett." Jace, second oldest, maybe 17, lean and watchful, with a look around the eyes that reminded her of someone calculating odds. Eli, who might have been 14 and had the haunted look of a boy who'd recently stopped being allowed to be sad. Sam, 12 or 13, stocky, studying the ground. Henry, who was perhaps 10 and was chewing on something he probably shouldn't have been. And Emmett, little Emmett with the cut on his chin, who was looking at her with an expression she could only describe as cautious hope, which was almost worse than hostility. "All right," she said. "I'll wait." She sat down in one of the porch chairs. It creaked alarmingly but held. She set her bag at her feet. She looked out at the yard and the land beyond it and the pale autumn sky above everything, and she did not fidget or sigh or let any of the uncertainty she was feeling reach her face. After a moment, she heard shuffling. Emmett had climbed up the porch steps and was now standing 3 feet away from her, examining her with the frank curiosity of someone too young to know he should be more guarded about it. "But your hair is long," he said. "It is," she agreed. "Our mama had long hair." He said it the way children say true things, directly, without understanding that the statement might land like a stone. "Papa cut it off after she died. It was in a braid. He keeps it in the box in his room." She looked at him. "What was her name?" "Clara." He said it quietly, like a word he'd been told to be careful with. "She died when I was 4. I don't remember her face right. Just her voice, kind of. And her hair." Savannah didn't say anything for a moment. There was nothing to say that wouldn't be wrong in one direction or another. "I'm sorry," she said finally. "That's a hard thing to carry." Emmett looked at her with those cautious eyes. "Are you going to be our new mama?" "I'm going to marry your father," she said carefully. "That doesn't automatically make me your mama. That's something that happens differently for every family. We'll figure it out as we go." He seemed to turn this over. "Colt says you probably won't stay." "Does he?" It was not a question either. She could feel the oldest boy's eyes on her from across the yard, where he'd gone back to some task near the fence, pretending not to listen. "He says women who come here don't usually last the winter." Emmett paused. "He said 3 other ladies looked at the ranch and left before they even unpacked." "I've already set my bag down," she said. Emmett looked at the bag. Then he sat down on the porch step in front of her, tucked his knees to his chest, and didn't say anything else. Which was, she understood, its own kind of answer. Silas Boone came out of the barn 40 minutes later. She heard him before she saw him. Heavy footsteps across packed dirt. The sound of a man who walks like he's working even when he isn't. He came around the corner of the barn and stopped when he saw her on the porch. And for just a second, a fraction of a second, something crossed his face that she couldn't name. Then it was gone. I was bigger than she'd pictured. Not tall, not exceptionally, but built close to the ground and solid all the way through, the kind of solid that comes from decades of physical work and not from any particular vanity about it. He had dark hair going gray at the temples, a beard that was 3 days past neat, and hands that looked like they'd been through more than hands should reasonably be asked to go through. He was, she estimated, somewhere in his mid-40s, though he wore it like a man who'd been 50 for a while and was working backwards. He walked to the foot of the porch steps and looked up at her. "Miss Reed." "Mr. Boone." A pause. He looked at her bag, at Emmett, who had fallen asleep against the porch post, at her face, briefly, in the way a man looks at a problem he is calculating. "You're smaller than I thought you'd be," he said. She had not prepared herself for that to be the opening line, but she supposed it was honest. "You're quieter than I expected," she replied. Something moved in his expression. Not quite a smile. The shadow of where a smile might have been, if smiling were something he still did regularly. "Supper's going to be whatever the boys put together," he said. "I didn't know exactly when you'd arrive." "That's all right. The room's off the kitchen. Small. I don't need much space." Another pause. He seemed to be deciding something. "Wedding Saturday. Reverend Marsh comes through every 2 weeks. We caught him at the right time. Saturday's fine." He nodded, like they'd agreed on a fence post placement. Then he turned and walked back toward the barn. "Mr. Boone," she called. He stopped. Turned. "It's good to meet you," she said. She meant it plainly. Not warmly, not coldly, just plainly. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Likewise," in the tone of a man who has said it as a formality for so long that he isn't entirely sure anymore whether he means it, but is at least trying to. Then he went back to the barn. Savannah sat back in the creaking chair and let out a slow breath through her nose. Emmett slept against the post. Somewhere out past the fence, Colt was hammering something with more force than the task probably required. She looked at the land again. All that sky, all that space. Well, she thought, here we are. The wedding happened on a Saturday morning that couldn't decide whether it wanted to be autumn or winter, and settled on a kind of sulky compromise that left frost on the grass and a pale, flat light over everything. Reverend Marsh was a round man with surprisingly kind eyes who performed the ceremony in the Boone front parlor with the 6 boys arranged in a row, like reluctant witnesses at a trial they hadn't been consulted about. Nora Calhoun was there, having appointed herself to the occasion without being invited and apparently without any concern that this was irregular. 2 neighboring ranchers and their wives stood near the back wall, curious and polite in the careful way of people who are reserving judgment. Silas stood beside her in a clean shirt and his good jacket, which he had pressed himself. She could see the slightly uneven crease, and held himself with the particular stiffness of a man undergoing something he has decided to endure rather than enjoy. She wore the blue dress. It was the best one she owned, and she'd repaired the hem the night before by lamplight, sitting on the narrow bed in the small room off the kitchen, listening to the sounds of the house settle around her. The creak of boys moving, a cough somewhere upstairs, the wind finding gaps in the eaves. Reverend Marsh said the words. She said her part. Silas said his, in a voice that was steady and entirely without inflection. When it was done, Nora Calhoun made a small sound of satisfaction, the way a woman does when something she has organized in her head finally occurs in the actual world. The boys didn't clap. Colt looked at the floor. Jace looked at the window. Eli looked at nothing in particular. The younger 3 looked at Savannah with varying degrees of open curiosity, uncertainty, and in Emmett's case, something that might generously be described as the earliest seed of hope. There was no cake. There was coffee and the remains of a peach preserve that Nora had brought, spread over bread that Savannah herself had baked at 5 that morning, because she'd been awake anyway, and the kitchen had been there and it had seemed like something useful to do. After Reverend Marsh had gone, and the neighbors had left with their careful, reserved goodwill, Silas stood in the kitchen doorway while she cleaned up the cups. "You didn't have to make bread," he said. "I was awake. Still." She turned to look at him. He was leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed, not hostile, just present in that watchful, contained way he had, like a man who has learned to observe things rather than participate in them. "Mr. Boone." "Silas," he said. "I suppose you'd better call me Silas." "Silas." She set down the cup she was holding. "I know what this is. I know what it isn't. I'm not expecting more from it than what it is. But I'd like us to at least be honest with each other. We'll both do better that way." He was quiet for a moment. I'm not dishonest. I didn't say you were. I'm saying, she stopped, chose her words. I'm saying I'm not a romantic. I'm not here because I thought this would be easy or because I had a dream about ranching in Nebraska. I'm here because I needed to be somewhere, and this somewhere needed someone. I intend to do right by your family. That's all I can promise, and I think it's worth something. He looked at her for a long moment. His expression was the same controlled, unreadable thing it had been for most of the last 4 days, and she was beginning to understand that this was simply his face. Not a mask exactly, more like a habit so deep it had become structural. It's worth something, he said finally. Then he pushed off the doorframe and went outside, and she heard his boots on the porch steps, and then nothing but the wind. She stood in the kitchen for a moment, alone, in the house that was now, technically, hers, or at least the one she lived in, and she felt the enormity of it press in on her from all sides. Not despair, not joy either. Something more complicated than either of those. Something that lived in the territory between them, where most real things actually happen. She picked up the cup again and finished washing it. Well, by the end of the first week, she understood the scale of what she had walked into. She'd expected hardship. The letter had said capable woman, not comfortable woman, and she'd read that clearly. But there is a difference between expecting hardship and standing inside it, and the first week in the Boone house delivered that difference with considerable efficiency. The pantry was a problem that revealed itself slowly and then all at once, the way problems tend to. The first 3 days she cooked from what was there, reasonable amounts, or so she thought. By the fourth day she was rearranging shelves and making calculations, and by the fifth day she understood that what she'd thought was a modestly stocked pantry was actually the result of someone, Colt. She'd learn later, carefully rationing what remained and arranging it to appear more plentiful than it was. The beans were getting low. The flour would last perhaps 3 weeks if she was careful. There was salt pork, but not as much as the family needed for winter. The potatoes in the root cellar were there, but not enough of them, and several had begun to go soft. She mentioned none of this to Silas. Not yet. She spent the fifth night making a written inventory in the small notebook she'd brought from Kansas City, using the stub of a pencil, sitting at the kitchen table while the house slept. Then she sat with the inventory and looked at it, and thought. The ranch itself was another matter. She could see from the evidence around her that it had been, at some point, a genuinely functioning operation. The barn was large and well built. The pasture fencing had clearly once been well maintained, but there were cattle missing. She could tell from the capacity of the barn and the actual head count she'd done casually on a walk. And the equipment showed the particular kind of neglect that comes not from laziness, but from too much else to manage and not enough hands to manage it. Silas rose at 4:30 every morning and was in the barn by 5. He came in for breakfast, said little, and went back out. He came in at noon, ate whatever there was, and went back out. By dark he returned to the house, moved through supper like a man completing a required function, and went upstairs. She had not seen him stop. The boys operated on a version of the same rhythm, scaled to their ages. Colt worked beside his father with a competence that was impressive and quietly heartbreaking. A 19-year-old doing the work of an experienced ranch hand, while the 19-year-old part of him went entirely unused. Jace disappeared for hours at a stretch on errands he described vaguely, and returned from with supplies he attributed to trading and favors in town. She filed this away without comment. Eli, 14, handled morning and evening chores with the wordless efficiency of someone who has stopped expecting anyone to notice. The younger boys had their tasks too, feeding chickens, hauling water, bringing wood, and they did them without complaint because complaint had apparently been discouraged long enough that it no longer arose naturally. What she noticed, underneath all of it, was what was missing. Noise, not the working noise, there was plenty of that, but the other kind. The kind that belongs to a family actually living in a house rather than simply occupying it. Nobody laughed. Nobody argued in the normal way of people sharing space. The boys spoke to each other in brief functional exchanges. They spoke to their father the same way. Nobody spoke to her at all, beyond necessity, except Emmett, who would appear beside her at intervals throughout the day and report, in his serious 7-year-old way, on various items of interest. A crow in the yard, a crack he'd found in the barn wall, a question about whether she knew how to make the kind of cornbread their mother used to make, with the crispy edges. "I don't know what kind your mother made," she'd said, "but tell me how you remember it, and I'll try to get close." He described it in great detail for a child with no culinary vocabulary. She'd written down what she could interpret and tried it that evening. It wasn't right, she knew that, but when she set it on the table, Emmett had gone very quiet in the way that children go quiet when something has surprised them past the point of immediate expression. I didn't say anything about it, but he ate 2 pieces. The first real confrontation happened 10 days in, and it began, as many things in that house began, with a door. Specifically, with the door to the supply room off the barn, which she went to check one afternoon and found padlocked. She stood looking at the padlock for a moment, then went to find Colt, who was in the yard, mending a section of harness with the focused, precise movements of someone who mends. Harness the way other people solve arithmetic, methodically, shutting out everything else. "The supply room's locked," she said. He didn't look up. "It's always locked." "Who has the key?" A pause. Just long enough to tell her the pause was intentional. "My father. I need to take stock of the supplies out there. I'm managing the household accounts, and I need to know what we have." Now he looked up. His eyes were the same dark, measured things they'd been since she arrived. Not unfriendly exactly, but defended in the way that takes years to become that automatic. "My father manages the accounts. I've been asked to manage the household." "That's not the same thing." She held his gaze. He was young, 19, and she understood the position he was in, had been in for God knows how long. The oldest son, the one who'd kept the machine running when the man running it had gone somewhere interior and unreachable. She was not, she decided, going to fight him about this. Not today. "Fair enough," she said, "but I need to know what's in the pantry and root cellar at a minimum. I've done an inventory. I'd like to sit down with you and go over it." He blinked. Whatever he'd been prepared for, it apparently wasn't that. "With me? You know this operation better than anyone. Your father's out on the north pasture, and I need someone who knows where things stand." She kept her tone businesslike. Not deferential, but not challenging either. "I'm not trying to step on anyone's territory, Colt. I'm trying to understand what I'm working with so I can do my job." A long moment. He set the harness down. "Come on then," he said. They sat at the kitchen table with her inventory notebook, and he went through it with her, correcting her estimates where she was wrong, confirming where she was right. He was precise and thorough, and she could see him recalibrating her in real time, this woman who had sat in her chair and taken inventory in a notebook, and now had the figures roughly correct. "You're short on flour for winter," she said, when they'd gone through everything. "I know. And the salt pork." "I know. What was the plan?" He was quiet for a moment. "My father was going to sell 3 head before the first freeze. Fill the gap." "Has he?" The pause. Longer than the others. "No." She looked at him. He was looking at the table. There was something there. She could see it pressing against the flatness he worked so hard to maintain. Some version of exhaustion that was deeper than the physical kind. "What's stopping him?" she asked. Quiet. Not demanding. Colt picked up his pencil and turned it in his fingers, not writing anything. He stopped. "He doesn't like to sell. Every head he sells is one less he's built. He thinks of it as giving up." She absorbed this. Even if keeping them means the family goes short on food. It was not quite a question. Colt's jaw tightened. He'd rather find another way. "Has he found one?" Colt didn't answer. She closed the notebook. "I'm going to talk to him." Colt's head came up sharply. "I know you wouldn't," she said, not unkindly. "But I'm not you, and I didn't come here to be quiet about things that matter." She stood up. "Thank you for sitting with me on this. It helped." He watched her go with the expression of someone watching a situation they have managed carefully for a long time, walk directly toward the one thing they've been keeping it away from. She found Silas at the north fence line, working alone in the gray afternoon light, resetting a post that had heaved in the last freeze. I was driving it with a maul, rhythmic and hard, the kind of work a man does when he needs to be hitting something. She walked up beside him and waited until he paused, breathing hard, leaning on the handle. "We're short on provisions for winter," she said. He looked at her. There was mud on his boots, and his face had the particularly wind-burned look of a man who hasn't been inside enough in the recent months. "I'm handling it." "Colt says you were going to sell 3 head. His expression shifted. Not toward anger, exactly. Toward something colder and more controlled than anger. Colt talks too much. Colt's been carrying this ranch on his back for what looks like about 2 years, she said evenly. He doesn't talk enough to anyone. He talked to me because I asked him directly, and he didn't see a way around it. She paused. When are you selling the cattle? A muscle in his jaw worked. When I decide to. We have 6 weeks before first hard freeze, and the boys need more food than what's in that pantry. 6 boys, Silas. Emmett's 7, and he's underweight. Don't... He stopped himself. The maul handle tightened in his grip. Don't tell me about my sons. I'm not telling you about them. I'm telling you about Winter. She kept her voice from rising. It cost her something. I understand what selling feels like to you. I understand it feels like losing ground you worked for. But there are 6 people in that house who need to eat through February, and the numbers don't work right now. He turned away from her and drove the post again. Once, twice. The sound carried flat across the open land. She stood there. She didn't leave. After the 3rd strike, he stopped. His shoulders were heaving slightly from the effort. He didn't turn around. 3 head, he said, to the fence post. I'll arrange it Thursday. She let the silence sit for a moment. Thank you, she said. She walked back toward the house. She did not look back to see whether he'd turned around. She knew he hadn't, but behind her, she heard the maul strike the post once more. A single, different blow. Not quite as hard. The difference between a man hitting something because he's angry and a man completing a task. It was a small distinction, but in her experience, small distinctions were where everything important lived. The kitchen became hers by degrees rather than by declaration. Nobody gave it to her. Nobody announced a transfer of authority. It simply happened, the way territory is claimed in a household. Through presence, through work, through the slow accumulation of evidence that the territory is being managed better than it was. She was up at 5 every morning, sometimes earlier. She cooked breakfast, real breakfast, with eggs from the hens she'd reorganized into actually producing, with the bread she baked every 2 days, with whatever came from the garden she'd begun rehabilitating in the evenings after supper. The kitchen garden had not been tended properly since, she guessed, before Clara Boone died, and most of what was there was straggly and past useful. But there were still some things worth rescuing. 2 rows of late turnips, some carrots that had survived neglect through sheer stubbornness, a patch of herbs gone wild that she trimmed back to usefulness. She found a recipe box in the back of the kitchen cabinet, behind a cast-iron pot that hadn't been moved in some time. It was Clara's, she knew immediately, from the handwriting, from the cards themselves, some of them stained with cooking, all of them handled enough to show they'd been used. She sat with it one evening for a long time, turning the cards over, reading them in the lamplight. She made Clara's cornbread recipe the next morning, the actual one. It was card 7, between molasses cookies and a winter stew. And when the boys came in for breakfast, Emmett stopped in the kitchen doorway and stood there looking at the pan. That's the right kind, he said. She set it on the table without ceremony. Sit down and eat it while it's hot. He sat. He ate 3 pieces. He didn't cry. He was 7 and working hard not to. She could see it in the set of his small jaw. But afterward he came to where she was standing at the stove and pressed his forehead briefly against her arm, the way a child does when they have no words for a thing, and their body goes ahead without them. She kept her eyes on the pot she was tending. She put one hand on the back of his head for a second. That was all. Silas was watching from the doorway. She didn't acknowledge him, and he didn't say anything, and after a moment she heard him pour his coffee and sit down at the table. The town's opinion of her arrived at the trading post on a Thursday. She'd gone in for flour and some thread. Her dress had developed a new tear at the sleeve from catching it on a fence post, and found 2 women from neighboring ranches already there who paused their conversation with the particular pausing quality of people who have just been discussing the person who has just walked in. Nora Calhoun, behind the counter, looked at Savannah with the expression of someone who is watching a thing unfold that she could have predicted. The 2 women were introduced as Margaret Holt and Frances Dawes. Margaret was the wife of the nearest ranch to the north, round-faced, with the relentless cheerfulness of someone who has decided happiness is a discipline. Frances was older, sharper, with the thin smile of a woman who trades in social currency and knows the exchange rate precisely. "We've been wondering about you," Frances said, in a tone that made wondering sound like an accusation. Silas Boone wasn't easy to live with before Clara passed. She shook her head delicately. He's a difficult man. Most people are given enough hardship, Savannah said pleasantly. How are you finding the ranch? Margaret asked, more kindly. It's a good piece of land, she said. And she meant it. She'd found, in the 2 weeks since arriving, that she'd developed a genuine feeling about the land itself that surprised her. The way the light moved across it in the evenings, the sound the wind made in the grass. The house needs work, but the bones are solid. And the boys? Frances said. 6 of them must be. They're fine boys, Savannah said, simply, directly, with a firmness that closed the inquiry. Frances's eyes sharpened. She wasn't used to being closed off like that. I heard Colt and Silas have been at odds lately, about the direction of things. Families have disagreements, Savannah said. That's not news. Nora set a sack of flour on the counter. That'll be 70 cents. Savannah paid her and gathered her things. At the door she paused and looked back at the 2 women. It was nice to meet you both, she said. And then, because she felt it needed to be said, the Boone family is doing all right. They're working on it. That's all any of us can say. She left before anyone could respond. Out on the street, with the flour over one shoulder and the autumn wind finding the gap at her collar, she felt the town watching her, from windows, from doorways, from the specific angle of men who are watching something they've decided they don't need to help but wouldn't mind watching fail. She had felt this before, in Kansas City, after Thomas died. The city had watched her too, with that same waiting quality, like an audience that has bought a ticket to something falling apart and is unwilling to leave before it does. She had not given them the performance then. She had no intention of giving this town one now. She lifted her chin against the wind and walked back to the wagon. It was in the 3rd week that she found Jace. Or rather, she had found the evidence of Jace 3 days earlier and spent 3 days deciding what to do about it. She'd been reorganizing the pantry and found, behind the flour sacks, a cache she didn't recognize. Tins, wrapped in cloth. Extra coffee. A package of dried beans she hadn't purchased. And behind those, a small box containing $7 in coins. She put everything back exactly as she'd found it. Then she watched. And she began to notice. Jace disappeared 2 or 3 afternoons a week on unexplained errands. He returned with nothing visible, but the pantry cache grew, incrementally. He was, she understood, doing something in town, trading, working odd jobs, maybe something else, and bringing home what he could without anyone knowing he was doing it. She cornered him one evening when he came in from the barn, before supper. "Walk with me for a minute," she said, and went out the side door without waiting to see if he followed. He followed. They stood in the yard on the far side of the house, out of earshot of the kitchen where Colt was helping the younger boys with something. "I found the cache in the pantry," she said. He went very still. 17, lean, with those calculating eyes. He was already preparing a story. She could see the machinery of it behind his face. "Before you explain," she said, "I want you to know that I'm not angry. And I'm not going to tell your father, not yet." He blinked. "Why not?" "Because whatever you're doing it to feed your brothers. I can see that clearly enough." She looked at him steadily. "But I need to know what it is, not to stop it. I need to know if it's something that's going to bring trouble to this family." A long moment. He looked at her like he was still calculating, but the calculation had shifted. He was now trying to figure out whether she was someone he could trust, which was a different problem than the one he'd been working on 30 seconds ago. "I've been doing farrier work," he said finally. "Pete Holt's got 3 horses that need attention, and he can't find anyone. And I've been running feed deliveries for the store on Tuesdays." She absorbed this. "Your father doesn't know. My father—" He stopped. His jaw tightened. "My father thinks we're fine. He thinks it's manageable. He's been thinking that for 2 years, and every winter we get a little closer to—" He stopped again. "To not being fine," she finished. He looked at the ground. "I'm not going to let my brothers go hungry because he won't—" He caught himself. "Sorry. You don't need to hear that." "Yes, I do," she said. "Say it." He looked at her. Some of the calculation went out of his eyes, replaced by something more tired and more honest. "He's proud. To a fault. He'd rather we starve in a way he can control than ask for help in a way he can't." A pause. "I've been picking up the slack because someone has to." She was quiet for a moment. Somewhere nearby an owl made one short call and went silent. "How long has this been going on?" "Since last spring." His voice had gone flat. Not emotionless. The kind of flat that is emotions compressed down by repeated pressure. "Things got tight, and he didn't want to show it. I started doing what I could without him noticing." "You're 17, she said. I know how old I am. She looked at him. He was trying very hard to sound older than he was, and mostly succeeding, which was the most heartbreaking part. This isn't your weight to carry alone, she said. Do you hear me? He looked away. I don't have a choice. You had a choice, that's what got you through. But now there are more of us. She let that sit for a moment. Keep the farrier work if you want. The experience is worth having, but bring it into the open. Or let me help you bring it into the open with your father, when the time is right. He looked at her for a long moment. You're going to tell him? Eventually, she said honestly. Not yet. Not until I know how he'll hear it. Something shifted in his face. Not trust, not yet. But the early motion toward it, the way ground shifts before it settles. All right, he said. They stood there a moment in the cooling evening, and then she went back inside and started supper. And he came in 3 minutes later like nothing had happened, and sat down at the table and helped Henry with the thing he was struggling with on his slate. And she watched him do it and thought, there's a good young man in there, underneath all that armor. Someone had better make sure it doesn't fossilize. On the last Saturday in October, a hard frost came overnight. She woke before it was fully light and lay in the narrow bed listening to the changed sound of the wind, the particular tone that says winter is not coming but has in fact arrived, months earlier than welcome. She dressed in the dark and went to the kitchen and built up the fire. She put on the big pot of oatmeal she'd been making every morning, the one that served 7 now and still stretched. She stood at the kitchen window watching the light come in across frost-whitened grass, the barn and the outbuildings emerging slowly from gray, smoke beginning to rise from the chimney of what she'd learned was the little cabin at the far edge of the property that nobody used anymore. She heard Emmett on the stairs before she saw him. Small feet, irregular rhythm. He came into the kitchen with his boots in his hand and his hair completely unaddressed, dropped into a chair, and struggled with the boots until she crossed over and knelt and helped him without being asked. It's cold, he announced. It is. Real cold. Yes. He looked at her as she worked the boot onto his foot. Are you staying? He asked. She looked up at him. His face was completely serious. 7 years old and completely serious. Asking the question the whole house had been orbiting around for 3 weeks without anyone actually asking it out loud. She tied off the lace. I'm staying, she said. He nodded slowly, like this had confirmed something he'd been working out in private. Then he got up and went to look out the window at the frost. Good, he said, to the glass. Quietly, like he was saying it to himself, not to her. 'Cause we needed someone to stay. She went back to the stove. The oatmeal was almost ready. In a few minutes, the boots would sound on the stairs again. First Colt, then the others, one by one, coming down into the kitchen she'd made warm against the cold outside. She stirred the pot and listened to the house beginning to wake up around her and felt the strange and unfamiliar weight of being needed somewhere. Not by Thomas, that need was gone, buried in a Kansas City churchyard, and she had made her peace with its going, but needed here, in this specific, difficult, broken, imperfect place. She did not call it home yet. She wasn't sure she'd earned that word or whether it had earned her, but she stirred the pot, and the fire burned, and one by one the boots sounded on the stairs, and outside the frost glittered across the land as the morning came on. It was a beginning. An incomplete, unresolved, honestly rather difficult beginning, but a beginning nonetheless. The frost that had settled over Ash Hollow at the end of October did not lift. It simply deepened, the way trouble deepens when nobody addresses it directly, incrementally, almost politely, until one morning you wake up and realize the ground has been frozen for 2 weeks, and you stop noticing when it happened. Savannah had been in the Boone house for 31 days when Silas sold the 3 head of cattle. He did it on a Thursday, as he'd said he would, drove them to town himself without a word to anyone at breakfast, and returned in the late afternoon with money he set on the kitchen table in front of her without ceremony, more than she'd expected, which told her he'd negotiated well, even when he hadn't wanted to do it. For the provisions, he said. Thank you. She counted it, wrote the figure in her notebook. I'll go into town Friday. He nodded and went upstairs to wash. That was the longest conversation they'd had in 4 days. She was learning the rhythms of him, the way you learn the rhythms of difficult weather. Not by understanding it exactly, but by observing it closely enough that you can recognize a change in pressure before the storm hits. Silas had 2 modes that she could identify with any reliability. The first was functional silence. He was present working, managing the ranch with a competence that was genuine even if it was increasingly insufficient. And he said little, but what he said was usually accurate and sometimes necessary. The second was something harder to name, a withdrawal that went further than silence, where he moved through the house and the day, like a man operating from some great interior distance, his eyes going somewhere she couldn't follow, his responses arriving late and traveling no further than the surface. I went into the second mode most often in the evenings. She'd noticed it first in the second week. After supper, after the boys had dispersed to their various orbits, Silas would sit in the chair by the front window, with a cup of coffee that went cold in his hand while he looked at something outside the glass that wasn't there anymore. She did not push on this. Not yet. She had learned something in those first weeks about the difference between what needed to be addressed immediately and what needed to be given room. What couldn't be given room anymore was the pantry situation, which she'd addressed. What couldn't wait was Emmett's cough, which had started as something minor and had graduated, over the course of November's first week, into something that woke her at 2 a.m. with its persistence. She'd gone to his room twice, the first time he'd been asleep and coughing in his sleep, which was worse than watching someone cough awake. The second time he'd been sitting up in the dark, small and miserable, with his knees pulled to his chest. "Come on," she'd said, and brought him to the kitchen and heated milk with some honey she'd found in the back of the cabinet, and sat with him at the table while he drank it. He didn't talk. She didn't talk either. There was something about 2 a.m. that made talking feel beside the point. When the milk was done, he'd looked at her and said, "Mama used to do this." She'd held his gaze and said, "Then it must be a good thing to do." He'd gone back to sleep eventually. She'd mentioned the cough to Silas the next morning over breakfast in the direct, factual way she'd found he responded to best. He'd sent for the doctor from the next town, which cost money she could see him calculating against what was left from the cattle sale, and said nothing more about it. The doctor had come, declared it a chest cold that needed watching, left some medicine, and charged $4. Emmett got better over the following week, incrementally, the way 7-year-olds get better. Suddenly and completely, as if he'd simply decided he was done being sick. But it had shaken something in Silas. She could see it in the 2 days after the doctor's visit, the way he looked at Emmett at meals. That particular look of a parent confronting the fragility of something they'd been telling themselves was fine. So, the first real explosion happened on a Wednesday evening in the second week of November, and it started, as these things often do, with something that seemed entirely unrelated to the thing it was actually about. Eli had broken a piece of equipment, a specific piece, a pulley mechanism attached to the water system in the barn, which Silas had been nursing for 2 years because replacing it cost money they didn't have. Eli had been using it, and something had slipped and the housing had cracked, and by the time Silas found it at the evening check, it was beyond repair. Dinner that night had a specific atmospheric quality, the one that settles over a room when everyone knows something is wrong and no one is acknowledging it. Savannah kept the conversation moving in the small ways she'd learned to manage it, asking Sam about the arithmetic problem he'd been working on, asking Henry what he'd seen on his walk to the creek that afternoon. She was aware of Silas at the head of the table saying nothing, his fork moving with a controlled, mechanical patience that she recognized as the exterior of something less controlled. It was Colt, finally, who said something, and what he said was not about the pulley. If we'd replaced that mechanism last spring, like I said, it wouldn't be an issue now. The table went quiet in a specific way. Silas set his fork down. "I recall the conversation," he said. His voice was even, too even. "I'm just saying, I know what you're saying, Colt." "Then you know I was right." It was the last word that did it. Not cruelly delivered, not even particularly loudly, but the rightness of it, stated plainly in front of everyone, which was the one thing Silas Boone could not absorb at a dinner table with 6 sons watching. "You think you can run this ranch better than I can?" The words came out with a control that was its own kind of anger. Colt met his father's eyes. He was 19 and exhausted and had been running on empty for 2 years, and something in him had apparently decided tonight that the empty had been reached. "I think there are decisions that have been made around here that I'd have made differently." "Yes." "Then you go ahead and say which ones." "Silas," Savannah said, not loudly, but directly. "I'd like to hear it." He wasn't backing down. Neither was Colt. They were looking at each other across the table with the specific, dangerous look of 2 people who have been circling an argument for long enough that the argument has acquired gravity. "The Kellerman offer," Colt said. 2 years ago. They offered to buy the north pasture and you turned them down because it was our land. Because you wouldn't admit we needed the money. Colt's voice cracked slightly on the last word. Not from tears, but from the pressure of something long held. We needed the money, Papa. We needed it then, and we're still short now, and Eli doesn't have proper boots for winter, and Emmett just had the doctor out here, and I've been... He stopped himself. You've been what? Savannah made a decision in approximately 2 seconds. He's been working to fill the gap, she said. Not loudly, not accusingly, just clearly into the silence. Barrier work, delivery runs. He's been doing it for months, so the pantry doesn't run out. Both of them have. Jace, too. The silence that followed was a different kind. The kind that has weight. Silas turned from Colt to Jace, who was sitting very still with his jaw set and his eyes on his plate. Then back to Colt. Is that true? He said. It wasn't a question. Yes, Colt said. Another silence. Then Silas pushed back from the table and stood up and walked out of the kitchen. Not slamming the door. The opposite of slamming, which was somehow worse. The careful, controlled closing of a man who doesn't trust what he'd do if he let go. The boys sat at the table. Nobody moved for a long moment. Then Jace said very quietly to his plate, "Well, that went well." Henry, who was 10 and had been watching the whole thing with wide eyes, said, "Is Papa coming back?" "Yes," Savannah said. "He's coming back. Finish your supper." She gave it 40 minutes. Then she put on her coat and went outside. Silas was in the barn, not working, sitting on a hay bale near the far wall with his elbows on his knees and his hands clasped, looking at the ground. The lantern threw long shadows across him. Outside the wind had picked up, and the barn walls gave back a low, steady moan of cold pressing against timber. She sat down on the hay bale 3 feet away from him and didn't say anything for a moment. The horses moved quietly in their stalls. Somewhere above them in the hayloft, something small shifted. "You knew," he said finally, not accusing, just saying the fact. "About Jason Colt?" "Yes. I found out about 2 weeks in." "And you didn't tell me?" "Not immediately, no." She paused. "I wanted to understand it first, and I wanted to figure out whether you'd hear it the right way." He muttered a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "And did I?" "Not yet," she said honestly. "But you walked away instead of saying something you couldn't take back. That's something." He was quiet again. He had the look, up close, of a man who has just had a door open to a room he'd been keeping shut for a long time, and is trying to decide whether the opening was a disaster or a relief, and suspects it might be both. "My father built this ranch," he said finally. "He started with 40 head and a piece of ground that nobody else wanted. He worked it until it was something. I grew up watching him work it." He paused. "I swore I would not be the one who lost it." She waited. "Clara dying..." He stopped. The name came out of him differently than everything else he said. Softer and older, and with a roughness at the edges that all the controlled flatness in the world couldn't fully smooth. "When Clara died, it just..." He stopped again, pressed his hands together. "There were months I don't remember very clearly, just going through the motions. The boys needed someone to be upright and functioning, so I was upright and functioning, and everything else..." He shook his head slowly. "Everything else went sideways." "And you couldn't ask for help," she said. Not a criticism, just naming it. "Boons don't..." He caught himself, almost smiled, without humor. "That's what I was going to say. My father used to say that. Boons don't ask for help. Like it was a point of pride." A pause. "Like it was honorable. And now?" He looked at his hands. "Now I find out my boys have been working themselves half to death in secret to keep the pantry stocked because they knew I wouldn't..." He stopped. Something moved through his face. It was the first time she'd seen it. A crack in the containment, real and raw. The look of a man who has just seen himself clearly from the outside and not particularly liked the view. "Colt's 19 years old," he said very quietly. "He should be..." He stopped. His throat worked. "He shouldn't be carrying what he's been carrying." "No," she said. "He shouldn't." Silence. "Neither should Jace," she said. "And Eli's been managing grief by shutting it down so hard it's going to cost him later. And Sam doesn't talk about anything that matters. And Henry pretends everything is fine because he's learned that's what's expected. And Emmett..." She paused. Emmett is 7 years old, and he asked me last week if I knew how to make his mother's cornbread, because nobody in this house has talked about Clara since the funeral, except him. The silence after that had a different quality. Denser. I'm not saying this to hurt you, she said, and she meant it completely. I'm saying it because I think you already know all of it. I think you've known it for a while, and you've been working around it because working around it felt more manageable than going through it. He sat with that for a long time. Long enough that the wind outside changed pitch. Long enough that one of the horses blew a long breath in his stall and shifted his weight. I don't know how to fix it, he said finally. It cost him something visible to say it. The words came out stripped of the usual careful management, and underneath them she could hear the thing he actually was. Not the rancher, not the widower, not the hard, capable man who drove fence posts with a maul and never asked for help. Just a man who was lost, and had been lost for 2 years, and was very tired of navigating by instruments he no longer trusted. You don't have to fix it tonight, she said. You just have to go back in there and say something true to your sons. That's all. He looked at her. What if I don't know what's true anymore? Then start with what you know for certain. She stood up. You love them, that's certain. Start there. She left him in the barn. She did not look back this time either, but when she reached the barn door and pushed through it into the cold, she heard behind her the particular sound of a man getting up off a hay bale with the deliberate, effortful motion of someone who has decided to do something difficult. And then his footsteps, heading toward the barn door. She did not go back into the kitchen immediately. She stood on the porch for a few minutes, in the cold, looking at the dark land and the stars that had appeared between the clouds, and gave the space inside its privacy. Through the window she could see the lamplight and the shapes moving within it, Silas coming back through the door, the boys at the table, and then the long, still quality of a room where something is being said that has never been said before. She couldn't hear the words. She didn't need to. She could tell by the way Colt's shoulders dropped. That specific drop, a fraction of an inch, of someone releasing something they'd been holding rigid. That something real was happening in there. She could tell by the way Jace looked up from his plate and kept his eyes up, instead of cutting them back down the way he usually did when emotions entered the room. She could tell by the way Emmett climbed off his chair and went to his father and pressed himself against his side, which was so direct and uncomplicated and 7 years old that it made something pull tight in her chest. She went inside after a while. Nobody acknowledged that she'd given them privacy. Nobody acknowledged anything particular, because what had happened in the kitchen was of the kind that gets absorbed quietly rather than discussed. But the temperature in the room had changed. Not warmly, not dramatically. More the way air changes when a window you didn't know was stuck finally opens a fraction, and you realize the room had been closer than you thought. Silas looked at her across the kitchen when she came in. Just looked, briefly. She gave him a small nod and went to the stove to reheat what was left of the coffee. Nothing was resolved. Nothing was fixed. Old wounds don't close in one conversation. They have to be cleaned first, and cleaning hurts. And they close slowly, and sometimes wrong, and leave marks regardless. She knew that. She suspected Silas knew it too, or was beginning to. But Colt, doing the dishes at the basin, was moving differently. Not lighter exactly. He'd been carrying too long for it to feel light immediately, but differently. And Jace had stayed at the table instead of disappearing the moment supper ended, and was doing something with a piece of leather and a small knife, concentrating on the work, but staying. She poured her coffee and sat down and let the evening find its own level. December arrived without ceremony. The snows came early and came seriously, not the polite preliminary snows of late November, but real ones. The kind that mean business and stay. By the first week of December, there was 6 inches on the ground and more promised on the horizon, in the particular color the clouds turned when they had something they hadn't delivered yet. The barn work tripled. The horses needed extra feed, the cattle needed attention, and the morning and evening routine stretched to accommodate the cold and what the cold demanded. Savannah put herself in the rotation without asking. She could muck a stall, haul water, do what needed doing. The first morning she appeared in the barn at 5:30 with her coat and her work gloves. Colt had looked at her with visible surprise and then, after a moment, moved over on the bench to make room. You don't have to, he said. I know, she said, and started on the nearest stall. After that, he didn't mention it. After 3 days, it was simply what happened. She learned the ranch through her body that December, through the specific ache of hauling water in cold weather, through the way a pitchfork handles differently when your hands are stiff, through the rhythm of morning chores that the Boone family ran like a machine they'd all been part of so long, they'd stopped needing to communicate the parts. She learned where she fit in that machine, or rather, she found the places where she could be useful and occupied them without fanfare. What she was learning alongside the physical work was something more complicated, the architecture of what had broken in this family and what was still intact. Because there was still something intact. Under the damage, under the years of grief operating without outlet and pride operating without check, there was something real and stubborn. The boys loved each other. She could see it most clearly in the moments they thought nobody was watching. Sam defending Henry in an argument with Eli. Jace, on a Thursday evening, sitting with Emmett and patiently teaching him a card game for 45 minutes when he could have been doing something else. Colt, who was hard and managed and exhausted, stopping in the yard to look at something the youngest two were doing and having just a fraction of a second where his face forgot to be controlled, and was simply watching his brothers with the helpless regard of someone who would burn the whole world down before he let something hurt them. And Silas, who was not easy, who was not likely going to become easy, but who had, since the Wednesday in the barn, begun the almost invisible process of reorientation, like a ship adjusting its heading in tiny degrees. She saw it in small things, the way he would pause now, after dinner, and ask one of the boys a direct question about something in their day, instead of retreating immediately behind the newspaper or the window. The way he watched Emmett more consciously, more present, not with the guilty, stricken quality of a man in crisis, but with the beginning of actually being there. The way he said her name occasionally when he wanted her attention. Not Miss Reed, not the careful nothing he'd used in the first weeks, but Savannah, with the new and slightly tentative quality of someone trying out a word they've decided to allow themselves. It was not, she was careful to remind herself, a transformation. People don't transform. They shift, slowly, in the direction of persistent pressure and time. What she was watching was the beginning of a shift. She did not romanticize it. One evening in the second week of December, after the younger boys were in bed and Colt and Jace had gone upstairs, she was at the kitchen table with her notebook, the one where she kept the household accounts, when Silas came in from the cold, stamped his boots, and instead of going upstairs, sat down across the table from her. She looked up. "There's a rancher named Dwight Parsons about 6 miles south," he said, without preamble. "He's been having trouble with his fence line, something taking his cattle." He paused. "I was thinking I'd ride out tomorrow and see if I could help." She held his gaze. "That's a good idea." "I haven't been—" He stopped. "Chose a different approach. I've let things go. With the neighbors. We used to be—" Another pause. "People used to move more freely between the properties out here. And they stopped?" "I stopped." He said it flatly, without decoration. "After Clara, I didn't—" He shook his head slowly. "It felt like too much. People coming, asking how we were, bringing things. It felt—" He looked for the word. "It felt like being watched, like everyone was watching to see if we'd make it." "They probably were," she said. "People do that. It doesn't have to mean they want to see you fail." He looked at her for a moment, and she could see him working through something, some wall he'd built for reasons that had made sense at the time, and that he was now starting to measure against what it was costing him. "I'm going to ride out to Parsons tomorrow," he said again, as if saying it a second time made it more committed. "Good," she said. "Take Colt." He looked at her. "He should be riding with you," she said simply. "He should be learning the neighbors. He's going to run this land someday." A long moment. "You think he wants that?" "I think he's wanted nothing else since he was 12, and you probably know that." Silas was quiet. He picked up the edge of her notebook, looked at the figures there for a moment without reading them, and set it back down. Then he pushed himself to his feet. "I'll ask him," he said. She watched him go upstairs. She heard the muffled sound of him stopping at Colt's door, the low exchange of voices, and then Colt's door opening wider. She could tell by the change in how the sound carried, and then both voices, overlapping slightly, working through the logistics of a ride tomorrow, and what she recognized as the particular sound of a conversation between a man and his son that was happening on two levels at once. She closed her notebook and put out the kitchen lamp and went to bed, and through the thin walls of the small room off the kitchen, she could still faintly hear them talking. It was the first time in 31 days she'd heard Silas stay up past 9. The argument, the real one, The one that had been building since October happened on a Saturday in mid-December, and it involved everyone. It was Eli who started it, which surprised her. Eli was 14 and had seemed to her the most sealed of the brothers. The one who processed everything internally and released nothing, who answered questions with the minimum necessary and disappeared when emotions threatened to enter any room he occupied. She had been watching him with a specific kind of concern that she hadn't known how to address yet. He started it at breakfast, and he started it about nothing, about whether the far pasture gate had been left open, which it had, and which horse had been let near it, which had been Sam's responsibility. Sam said it wasn't his fault. Eli said it was. The argument escalated with the speed that arguments between brothers escalate when they're not actually about the gate or the horse. "You don't do anything right," Eli said, and it came out with a heat that was years old, not breakfast old. "Eli," Colt's voice. Warning. "He never does anything right, and nobody says anything because he's 12 and we're all supposed to." "That's enough," Silas said. "Why?" Eli's voice cracked, not from tears, from pressure, from what happened when you sealed something too long and it found the crack anyway. "Why is it always that's enough? That's all anyone ever says around here. That's enough. Don't stop. Everything just stops before it actually gets said, and then we all sit around being—" He pushed back from the table, the chair scraping hard. "Being fine. Like we're always fine. We're not fine. We haven't been fine since Mama—" He stopped himself, or tried to. But the word was already out in the room, and it hit the way it always hit, like a stone thrown into still water, the ripples going in every direction at once. Sam had gone white. Henry was very still. Emmett had put down his fork and was looking at Eli with the enormous, careful eyes of a child, watching something he doesn't have words for yet. Eli stood there breathing hard, his jaw working. He was 14 and furious and heartbroken, and had been both for at least 2 years, and all of it was on his face now. Everything he'd kept behind the sealed door, out in the air where everyone could see it. Nobody spoke. Then Savannah said, "Sit down, Eli." His eyes snapped to her. There was challenge in them. The specific teenage challenge of "don't tell me what to do, you are not my mother." And she met it levelly. "Not because you're wrong," she said. "Sit down because this conversation deserves to happen properly. Not standing up with a chair between you and your family." A beat. 2. He sat down. She looked around the table. At Silas, who had gone the careful, controlled blank he went when things came too close. At Colt, whose jaw was tight. At Jace, who was watching with the closed, measuring quality he put on when he was actually most invested. At Sam, who looked like he was trying to disappear into the chair. "Eli's right," she said. "And everyone at this table knows he's right, including your father." She paused. Let that land. "And I know none of you know exactly what to do with that, because this family has been operating on that's enough for a long time, and it's become the default. But it's—" She stopped, found the words. "It's a way of surviving. It's not a way of living." Silas looked at her. There was something in his face she hadn't seen before. Not anger, not that controlled withdrawal. Something rawer. The look of a man who has been quietly accused of something true. "What would you have us do?" he said. Quiet. Not hostile, just asking. "Talk," she said. "About her. About what it's been like. About what you miss. About what's been hard." She looked at Emmett, who was very still. Emmett was 4 when his mother died. He's 7 now, and he still talks about her more than any of you because he didn't learn yet that he's not supposed to. A silence that was different from any silence the kitchen had held before. Then Sam, who never said anything, who was 12 and stocky and processed everything by going quiet, said, in a voice that was very small for a 12-year-old, "I forgot what she smelled like. I've been trying to remember and I can't." And something happened in the kitchen then. Not dramatically, not the way it happens in stories, where one admission unlocks everything and people weep and embrace and the air changes. It was messier than that. It was Silas making a sound that he cut off immediately, his hand going to the table. It was Colt looking at Sam with an expression that had finally stopped being controlled. It was Eli, still breathing hard, his face doing something complicated that involved his eyes going bright. It was Emmett getting up from his chair and going to Sam and pressing his small shoulder against his brother's arm without explanation. It was Jace, after a long moment, saying very quietly, "She smelled like cedar. She kept cedar in the linen chest." A pause. "Every time I air out the blankets, I—" He stopped. The kitchen held all of it. Savannah did not speak again. She had said what needed saying, and now the thing needed its own time and its own shape, and it was not hers to manage. She got up quietly and refilled the coffee and set more bread on the table and stayed in the kitchen, present but out of the way, while the Boone family did the thing they had not done since the funeral, the painful, necessary, long overdue work of grieving out loud in the same room, together. It went on for a long time. Not smoothly. Nothing that real is smooth. There were silences that lasted too long, and moments where someone said something that landed wrong and had to be reapproached. And Silas said almost nothing for much of it, but stayed in his chair, which was its own form of participation. The participation of a man who has decided to stop leaving. At some point, without anyone announcing it, his hand found the back of Emmett's neck and stayed there. And Emmett leaned into it with the complete unself-conscious trust of a small child who has just been given back something he thought was gone. When it was over, not resolved, because these things don't resolve, they only open and breathe and begin the long work of healing. When it was over, or as over as it was going to be that morning, Silas looked at her from across the table. "Thank you," he said. She nodded once. She didn't make anything more of it than that. But later, when the boys had dispersed and the table was being cleared, Colt stopped beside her at the basin and stood there for a moment, not looking at her, drying a cup with the same focused care he brought to everything. "I owe you an apology," he said. She glanced at him. "For what?" "For telling Emmett you probably wouldn't stay." He paused. "First week you were here." She remembered. She had heard it then and filed it away without reaction. "You were protecting him. I was being—" He seemed to be choosing his word. "I was being unfair. I decided what you were before you had a chance to show me." He set the cup down. "You didn't have to push for all that," he said, with a motion toward the kitchen table, the morning, everything that had happened in it. "You didn't have to do any of it. It's not your—" He stopped. "It wasn't your problem to fix." She looked at him steadily. "Maybe not, but I live here now." He absorbed that. Then, with the slightly painful economy of a young man who is not practiced at this, "I'm glad you stayed." She didn't say "I told you so." She didn't say anything that would have made it smaller. "Go do your chores," she said, "and take your brothers with you. They need the air." He went. And out the window, she watched him call to Sam and Henry and Eli with something approaching his actual voice. Not the managed duty voice, but something younger and more ordinary. And she stood at the basin with her hands in cold water and felt the complicated, imperfect, genuinely fragile thing that was beginning to grow in this house between its walls. The snow had stopped overnight and the morning had come out clear and cold and absolute, and the land lay quiet under it. And somewhere out past the fence, the boys' voices carried back toward the house in the still air. The visit to Dwight Parsons' ranch had changed something in Silas. Not dramatically, not in the way a man wakes up one morning decided. More like the slow correction of something that had been set crooked for a long time. He rode out that Sunday with Colt beside him and came back 3 hours later with the particular look of a man who has been reminded that the world contains other people and that this is not, in fact, a burden. Parsons was a wiry, sun-leathered man in his late 50s who had ranched the South Valley for 30 years and possessed the specific unsentimentality of someone who has survived long enough in difficult country to know exactly what matters. He'd shaken Silas's hand at the gate with the directness of a man who'd been waiting for this visit for longer than he'd admit, and he'd greeted Colt with the kind of respect that's given not to a boy, but to the person that boy has actually become, which Savannah, hearing about it later, understood had landed on Colt in a way that a month of her own efforts couldn't have produced, because it came from someone whose opinion Colt had been raised to regard. They'd fixed the fence line together. Parsons had fed them lunch. By the time they'd ridden home, something between Silas and Colt had shifted. Nothing declared, nothing resolved, but the way they moved through the kitchen door together had a different quality than any door they'd come through since she'd arrived. "Good man, Parsons," Silas had said at supper, with the brevity of someone for whom that sentence contained considerably more than it appeared to. "He said to say hello to you," Colt added, looking at Savannah. "Said he'd heard good things." She'd raised an eyebrow. "From whom?" Nora Calhoun, he thought. She'd gone back to her plate. Nora Calhoun, she was learning, was the valley's central nervous system. Everything passed through her trading post sooner or later, and Nora processed it with the even-handed efficiency of a woman who had long ago made peace with the fact that she knew everyone's business, and had decided to use that knowledge carefully rather than carelessly. The visit to Parsons opened something. Over the following 2 weeks, Silas made 3 more rides, to the Holt property to the north, to a smaller operation run by a young couple named Garrett, who had arrived in the valley the previous spring and were finding their first winter harder than anticipated, and once with Jace to the trading post for a conversation with Nora that lasted almost an hour, and that Jace described afterward simply as a lot of talking, mostly her, but Papa was listening, which I've never really seen him do in town before. The ranch itself was finding its rhythm, not comfortably. Nothing about the work was comfortable, particularly in December, when cold made every task take longer and the animals needed more and the days were too short. But the rhythm was there, and in the rhythm there was something that hadn't been there in September, people actually talking to each other while they worked. Not much. Boone men were not apparently people to whom words came easy. But enough. Enough that the silence when it occurred was the companionable kind rather than the loaded kind. It was Nora Calhoun who brought the first news about the Red Canyon Riders. She came to the house on a Tuesday morning in late December, which was unusual enough. Nora did not make social calls. She received them, that Savannah knew before the woman even dismounted that something had happened. Nora tied her horse at the post and came up the porch steps with the brisk movement of a woman on business. And when Savannah let her in and poured her coffee, she set both hands flat on the kitchen table and said, without preamble, "There's been trouble at the McKinney place." Savannah sat down. "What kind?" "Men came through 3 nights ago. 6 of them, maybe more. McKinney wasn't sure of the count in the dark. They ran off 4 head of cattle, broke the door off the smokehouse, helped themselves to whatever they wanted, left a message." She paused. "Told McKinney they'd be back. Said Ash Hollow was now their territory, and he could either pay a monthly fee or find out what happened to ranches that didn't." The kitchen was quiet for a moment. From upstairs, the distant sound of Emmett and Henry in some ongoing argument about something, the ordinary noise of a household existing. "Who are they?" Savannah asked. Savannah called themselves the Red Canyon Riders. I'd heard the name, came out of the mountain passes to the west, maybe 2 years back. They've been working the valleys up north, apparently. Nothing big enough to bring serious attention, small enough operations that nobody organized against them. Nora picked up her coffee cup but didn't drink from it. "They've moved south now, and McKinney's place isn't the first. The Garrett boy, the young couple down past the creek. They had a man ride through last week. Just one, just looking," he thought. Now he thinks he was being assessed. Savannah absorbed this. She was thinking about the Garretts, young, inexperienced, under-resourced. She was thinking about Parsons to the south, who was old and able but alone. She was thinking about the valley as a whole, the properties scattered across it like separate islands, each managing their own affairs, separated by enough distance and enough self-sufficiency to have stopped thinking of themselves as neighbors in any functional sense. "Does Silas know?" she asked. "I'm telling you first," Nora said. She met Savannah's eyes directly. "Because I want to know what you think before the men get involved, and the conversation becomes about rifles and pride." The 2 women looked at each other across the table. Outside, the wind moved through the yard. "Tell him now," Savannah said, "while Colt and Jace are both here." She was in the kitchen when she heard the conversation shift in the front room. The particular shift in a man's voice when something has moved past the abstract and landed in the personal. Silas's voice, low and controlled, asking Nora questions with the specific sharpness of a man running calculations. Colt's voice, less controlled, with the forward energy of someone who wants to act immediately and is restraining it. Nora left an hour later, promising to pass word along to the other properties she visited. Silas came into the kitchen and stood with his back to the counter, arms crossed, in the posture he took when he was turning something over and didn't want to be rushed. She was peeling potatoes and did not stop. "You heard," he said. "Enough." He was quiet for a moment. "McKinney's a capable man. He'll handle it." She set down the potato and the knife and turned to look at him. "Handle it how? They ran off 4 head and told him to pay tribute. What does handling it look like, paying or losing the rest? It's his affair." "Silas." She kept her voice even. "One family can't manage 6 armed men. That's not weakness. That's arithmetic." He looked at the window. "The territory keeps its own order out here, always has. From what Nora's describing, the territory's order is exactly what these men are counting on," she said. Isolated ranches. Nobody looking at anyone else's problem because everyone's managing their own. That's not order. That's the condition that makes this possible. His jaw was tight. You want me to ride to McKinney's and get in the middle of another man's dispute? I want you to consider that it won't stay his dispute. She picked up the knife again. They said Ash Hollow is their territory, not McKinney's ranch, the whole valley. Colt appeared in the kitchen doorway. He'd clearly been listening. He didn't apologize for it. She's right, he said. Papa. Silas looked at his son. We can't sit on our hands and wait for them to knock on our door, Colt said. By then it's too late to organize anything. Silas was quiet for a long moment. He looked at his hands, at the counter, at something in the middle distance that was the particular view of a man doing internal accounting. I'll ride to McKinney's tomorrow, he said finally. Talk to him. See what he actually knows. Take Colt, Savannah said. He looked at her. There was something in his expression that was more aware now than it had been in September. As if over the past 2 months he had gradually come back to a surface he hadn't realized he'd drifted from. Already planning to, he said. What Silas and Colt came back with from the McKinney place was worse than Nora's account and worse than Savannah had calculated. It wasn't just McKinney. It was 3 other properties that hadn't sent word. Smaller operations. People who were frightened enough to stay quiet, which was exactly the condition the Red Canyon riders depended upon. A man named Buckley, who ran 30 head on the east slope, had paid the first demanded fee 2 weeks ago without telling anyone, because he had a pregnant wife and 2 small children and had made the calculation that $60 was worth less than a confrontation. A widow named Patterson, 10 miles south, had found her fence line deliberately cut and 2 horses missing. No men sighted, no demands made, just damage done in the dark as a demonstration. What it was beginning to look like, Silas said at the kitchen table that evening, with a flatness in his voice that was different from his usual flatness, tighter, with something behind it, was a systematic operation, not random theft. Strategy. They come in stages, Colt said. He had a roughly sketched map on the table marking properties. First they assess. One man, passing through, looking at what's there and how many people and how well armed. Then they send a larger group for a first strike, small enough to leave open the question of whether to fight. Then they send the demand. If you pay, you're marked as compliant. If you don't, he stopped. What did McKinney say about what happens if you don't? Savannah asked. A pause between father and son. He'd heard from a man who came through from the North Valley, Silas said. Family up there didn't pay. Lost the barn. Burned? Yes. The kitchen held that for a moment. Emmett was in bed. The younger boys were upstairs. Jace sat at the far end of the table, turning his coffee cup in his hands. How many men does McKinney think they're running? Savannah asked. 15, maybe 20. Silas's voice was flat. Led by someone called Rourke. Nobody seems to have seen him directly. He sends others to do the visible work. She looked at the map. She was thinking. She had been thinking since Nora's visit, and the shape of what she was thinking was not comfortable, but it was clear. We need to unite the ranches, she said. Silence. Not to fight. Not yet, she said, before Silas could say what she could see forming on his face. To talk. To get every family in this valley in the same room so they know they're not alone, and so we can figure out together what a coordinated response looks like. She paused. Because right now, these men are counting on what this valley's been doing for years. Everyone handling their own piece, separately. Nobody talking to anyone else. You could have 15 armed men defending this valley if you all knew about each other. Right now, those same 15 men are scattered across separate properties, each one convinced they're the only one with the problem. Joel, Jay said slowly. She's right. I know she's right, Silas said, with a sharpness that was not directed at her. It was the sharpness of a man who is frustrated by the size of the thing he has to do. Who do you talk to? Colt asked. Who carries the message to all the properties? Nora, Savannah said immediately. She knows everyone. She's already moving in that direction. She came here first, and she'll go to the others. She paused. But someone needs to make the official ask. A gathering. Here. Silas looked up. Here. This is the most central property, and, she chose her words, and you're Silas Boone. You've been here longer than most of them. That means something. I was very still for a moment. She could see him working through what that meant, opening his house, becoming the center of something, leading instead of enduring. All the things that pride and grief had made him contract away from. "I'll need to ride to Parsons first," he said finally. "He's the one most of the South Valley will listen to." "Tomorrow," she said. "Tomorrow," he agreed. The gathering happened 5 days before Christmas, on a Sunday afternoon, and it was not comfortable. 11 families came. Not all of them. The Buckleys declined, too frightened. The widow Patterson sent her eldest son, 19 and grim-faced. The Garrett couple came, the young woman visibly tired in the way of someone who hasn't slept properly in days. Parsons was there with 2 of his ranch hands. Nora Calhoun stood near the wall and said very little, which meant she was listening to everything. Savannah had moved the kitchen table to the parlor and added every chair the house contained, plus benches pulled from the barn. There were 23 people in the Boone front parlor, which was approximately 19 more than it had ever held, and the room had the tense, watchful quality of people who have been told something is wrong and have not yet agreed on what to do about it. Silas stood at the front. He was not a natural speaker. She could see the cost of it in the set of his jaw, but he spoke plainly and without embellishment, which turned out to be more persuasive than either would have been. He laid out what they knew: the pattern of the operation, the properties affected, the name Rourke, and the approximate size of the group. When he finished, a man named Collier, from the north edge of the valley, red-faced, with the aggressive confidence of someone who is frightened and covering it, said immediately, "We should ride to the law." "Nearest sheriff is 40 miles, Parsons said from his chair. "In this weather, that's 2 days each way, and he's got 3 deputies for 200 square miles. Then we wait for the army." "The army is not coming," Silas said. Not unkindly, but with a finality that closed the door. "Then what exactly are you proposing?" Collier said, and his eyes moved to Savannah, who was standing near the kitchen door, which she registered as deliberate. "Mrs. Boone has been working on a proposal," Silas said. She felt the room shift. Felt it the way you feel weather shift, in the quality of attention. Some of it was genuine curiosity. Some of it was the very specific skepticism directed at women who speak in rooms where women are expected to observe. She had anticipated this. She had also decided she did not particularly care about it in any way that would stop her from speaking. She moved to where Silas had been standing. "6 weeks ago, we were on our own," she said. "Every family in this room was managing their own piece of ground, and not thinking much about what the next family over was managing. That condition, that isolation, is what made this valley a target." She paused. Let that land before continuing. "These men didn't ride into a community. They rode into a collection of separate problems, and they're treating them separately, one family at a time, quietly enough that nobody organized." "What you're describing is common sense," said the Garrett woman. May, her name was. She said it with a tiredness that was more agreement than objection. "It is," Savannah said, "but common sense and common action aren't the same thing. What I'm proposing is this. We consolidate. Not permanently, not merge anyone's property or operations. But for the duration of this threat, we move toward one another instead of apart. Families that are isolated or most vulnerable come to properties with more capacity. We share resources, share watches, share information. We make the valley a harder target than these men calculated it would be." She looked around the room, at faces that were skeptical, at faces that were tired, at a few that were beginning to calculate. "They're counting on 15 separate problems. We become one." Collier shook his head. "That's a lot of trust between people who barely know each other." "It is," she agreed, "but the alternative is what you've been doing, which is managing alone. And we've seen how that goes for the Buckleys and for Mrs. Patterson." "Some of us have children," May Garrett said. Not objecting, just stating the weight of what was being asked. "So do we," Savannah said. "Emmett's 7. I am acutely aware of what we're discussing." A pause. "That's precisely why isolation seems to me the most dangerous option." Parsons spoke from his chair, and when he spoke the room settled into a different kind of listening. The listening given to a man who has been here longest and is known to be neither reckless nor soft. "She's not wrong," he said. "I've been ranching this valley for 30 years. I've seen trouble come and go. It passes through isolated places and it stops at united ones. That's not hope. That's observation." The room was quiet for a moment. Then Silas said, "Parsons is right. And I'll say this." He stopped. He was not comfortable with what he was about to say, which was exactly why it carried weight when he said it. I've been the most isolated of anyone here, by choice. I made that harder on everyone, including myself, and I don't intend to keep doing that. He looked at the room with the particular look of a man who is saying something difficult in public for the first and possibly only time. This valley works together or it doesn't work. That's the choice. It was not unanimous. It was not easy. Collier argued for another 20 minutes. Two other men raised objections that were reasonable and had to be worked through on the spot. The details were argued: who moved where, what the watch rotation would look like, how supplies would be shared across consolidated properties. But when the room finally dispersed in the early evening, every family there had agreed to at least the first stage: communication, a signal system, regular riders between properties, and an agreement that no family would negotiate separately with the Red Canyon riders or pay another cent without the valley knowing. It was not a fortress, it was not an army, but it was the beginning of something that had not existed in Ash Hollow before, a valley that was talking to itself. Savannah was cleaning up after the gathering when she heard the voices outside, but low, at the edge of carrying distance, near the barn. She looked out the window. Two of the men who'd attended were standing with Collier near the gate, and Collier was talking with the compressed, emphatic quality of someone making an argument he didn't make inside. She couldn't hear the words, but she could read the body language, the glance toward the house, the specific kind of headshake that means that woman. She watched them for a moment, then turned away from the window. Nora appeared in the kitchen doorway, having apparently stayed when everyone else left. She looked at Savannah with the direct, slightly unnerving gaze she deployed when she was going to say something true. Collier thinks you have no business speaking on behalf of this valley, Nora said. He'll make things harder for you. I expect he will, Savannah said. She was drying a cup. It doesn't bother you? It bothers me, she said honestly. It doesn't change what needs to happen. Nora was quiet for a moment. Then, in the tone of someone making a concession they don't make easily, you did well tonight, what you said, the way you said it. Not everyone could have walked into that room and said that. Savannah looked at her. You could have. The older woman allowed herself a small, dry smile. I'm not married to Silas Boone. That matters out here. More than it should, but there it is. She took her coat from the hook by the door. They'll listen to you because he stood beside you instead of in front of you. Don't take that wrong. He did right by you tonight. I just want you to know the math of it. I understand the math, Savannah said. Nora buttoned her coat. At the door she paused. The riders aren't going to like being organized against. When they find out the valley has consolidated, and they will find out, they'll push harder before they back down. Men like that always do. I know, Savannah said. You ready for that? She thought about it honestly. She thought about Emmett upstairs, and the boys, and Silas, and the long winter with its particular combination of cold and threat, and fragile new things that could still break if the wrong thing pressed against them. No, she said, but I don't think ready is the condition here. I think it's necessary, and those are different things. Nora looked at her for a moment, the long, evaluating look of a woman who has seen many things come through Ash Hollow and developed a reliable sense of what stays and what doesn't. Get some sleep, she said. Both of you. You'll need it. She went out into the cold, and her horse's hooves were loud and then fading and then gone, and the valley lay quiet under the winter stars. Savannah stood alone in the kitchen for a long moment. The fire had burned down. The cups were clean. Through the ceiling she could hear the small sounds of the boys settling for the night. The creak of beds, a murmur, then quiet. She thought about what Nora had said, about pushing harder before backing down. She had known this was coming, had known it since the morning Nora had set her flat hands on this table and said the McKinney name. She had organized toward it anyway, because the alternative was to wait for it to arrive on their doorstep at a time and in a form they hadn't chosen. Silas came into the kitchen. He poured himself the last of the cold coffee and stood at the counter drinking it, looking at her. Collier's going to be a problem, he said. Yes. You heard? I saw. He set the cup down. You did right tonight, he said. The words came with the deliberate quality he brought to things he meant precisely. What you said in there, the way you held the room, it wasn't... He stopped. I couldn't have done that. You did exactly what needed to be done, she said. You opened your house and you stood up and said a hard thing plainly. That's what those men needed from you. He looked at her with the expression she'd been seeing more of lately. Not the controlled blankness, Not the strategic flatness, but the actual face of him, whatever it was. Still not easy to read, still not open in any simple way, but present. Whatever's coming, he said slowly, we're more ready for it than we were last week. A little, she said, which will have to be enough for now. He nodded. He set his cup in the basin, and before he went upstairs he paused in the kitchen doorway, the same doorway he'd stood in 100 times since September, and said without looking back, I'm glad you said yes to that letter. She heard him on the stairs, heard the house settle around his weight. She stood in the cooling kitchen and felt the winter pressing at the windows and the valley out beyond them, full of families who had, tonight, turned a fraction of a degree toward one another. It was not safety. Not yet, and maybe not for a while. The wolves, as Nora had said, would push back. She had no particular illusions about that. But something had changed in Ash Hollow tonight. Something that, once started, could not be entirely undone. She put out the lamp and went to bed, and outside the wind moved through the dark valley, and the stars were very clear. Nora had been right about the pushing back. She usually was. The first sign came 4 days after the gathering, on a Thursday morning when young Garrett rode up to the Boone gate at a hard pace with his face the particular white of someone who has not slept and has been riding through cold for an hour. Savannah was in the yard when he arrived, and she got to him before Silas did. They hit Parsons, he said, breathing hard, his horse blowing steam into the cold air. Last night, late, ran off 8 head and put a man on his porch with a message. She kept her voice level. What message? Garrett's jaw was tight. That the next property to hold a meeting like Sunday's would lose more than cattle. Silas appeared at her shoulder. He'd heard enough. He looked at Garrett and then at the horizon in the direction of Parsons's property, and she could see the calculation moving through him. Distance, time, what needed to happen first. Go inside and get warm, he told Garrett. Colt. This over his shoulder, and Colt was already there, having materialized from the direction of the barn with the particular alertness of a 19-year-old who has been waiting for something to require him. Ride to McKinney. Tell him what happened. Tell him to send his own rider south and west. I want every property that was at Sunday's meeting to know by nightfall. And Parsons? Colt said. I'm going to Parsons. I'm coming with you, Savannah said. Silas turned to look at her. There was a half-second of the old reflex. The instinct to say no, stay here, and she watched him move past it. Get your coat, he said. Parsons was unhurt, which was the first relief. He met them at his gate with the contained fury of a man who has been provoked past the point of patience and is now operating in the colder, more dangerous register beyond it. He shook Silas's hand and gave Savannah a nod that held considerably more respect in it than his first greeting had. She noted this and filed it away. 8 head, he said. The good ones. They knew which ones to take, which means they've had someone watching this property. He said it without particular emotion, the way you state a tactical fact. The man they left on my porch, young, maybe 20, scared actually, gave me the message and left at a run. They're sending boys to do the talking. Keeping the experienced men back, Savannah said. Both men looked at her. Yes, Parsons said. Exactly. They sat at his kitchen table and she listened more than she spoke, which was deliberate. Parsons needed to feel that Silas was leading this, and Silas needed to feel that too. What she was doing was watching. She was watching the way Parsons held himself, the specific calculation in his eyes when he talked about his horses and his land, the point at which his voice changed from tactical to personal. She was building a map of what this man was willing to do and what he would resist and where he needed to be approached from. We need to consolidate sooner than we planned, she said, when there was a moment. The attack on your property is the answer to the gathering. They're not going to wait for us to organize properly. We need to move first. Move how? Parsons asked. The most vulnerable properties. The Garretts, the widow Patterson, Buckley, if we can convince him. Come here or come to us. Pool the able-bodied men and establish a watch rotation that covers both properties as one defended position. We stop being targets by stopping being separate. Parsons was quiet, turning his coffee cup. That means opening my house to people I barely know. It does, she said, not apologizing for it. He looked at Silas. Your wife always this direct? Always, Silas said, with something in his voice that she hadn't heard before. A dry thing. Not quite humor, but somewhere in that territory. and carrying with it a kind of possession that was not ownership but something more like pride. Parsons almost smiled. "All right," he said, "tell me what you need." The consolidation took the better part of a week, and it was neither smooth nor quiet. The Garretts came first, May with their infant daughter and their 2 horses, her husband Cal with a rifle he clearly knew how to use, and a jaw set with the particular determination of a young man who has decided that retreating is not the same as surviving. They moved into the Boone house's spare room and the old cabin at the edge of the property that Savannah had spent 2 days making habitable, rechinked, clean, with the small iron stove working properly for the first time in what looked like years. Parsons consolidated with McKinney to the south, the 2 ranches operating as one watch zone with riders moving between them at regular intervals. The widow Patterson, whose eldest son had come to the meeting, agreed to come to the Boone ranch for the duration. She arrived on a Wednesday with her 3 youngest and very little else, and was installed in the front parlor with the particular quiet dignity of a woman who does not intend to be a burden and is determined to demonstrate this by being useful immediately. Mrs. Patterson, whose first name was Ruth, turned out to be an exceptional shot, better than any of the men who found this out, which she demonstrated without drama on a Thursday afternoon when a coyote came too close to the chicken run, and she put it down from 40 yards with a .30 caliber rifle in a single motion, then went back to what she'd been doing. Jace watched this with visible admiration. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" he asked. "My father," she said. He had 6 daughters and no sons, and was not going to let circumstances make that a problem. By the time the Boone house held 4 families, it was loud in a way it had never been in the months since Savannah arrived. Not the loud of conflict, but the loud of life packed in close, children in the kitchen, men moving through the yard at all hours. The particular organized chaos of people who have set aside the normal careful distances of neighbors and are living in each other's space, whether any of them find it entirely comfortable or not. Emmett, for his part, was in a state of uncomplicated delight. There were 3 other children under 10 in the house now, including the Garrett baby, and Emmett had appointed himself ambassador to all of them with the serious enthusiasm of a boy who has spent too long as the youngest in a household of big people and has abruptly found his correct scale. He appeared at Savannah's elbow one afternoon while she was organizing the expanded kitchen rotation. "Callie Garrett tried to eat a wood chip," he reported. "She's 8 months old, Emmett. That's what they do." "I stopped her," he said with considerable pride. "Good." She handed him a basket. "Go get the eggs and stop supervising the baby." He took the basket and went, and she could hear him in the yard talking to Callie Garrett's older brother, a 6-year-old named Paul, about the relative merits of different kinds of birds, which was a conversation that apparently could sustain both of them indefinitely. She stood in the kitchen listening to the noise of the full house, and felt, for a moment, something she hadn't expected, the sharp, slightly frightening awareness that she had built something here. Not alone. She was careful with herself about that, because it had not been alone, not even close. But she had been part of building it, and what had been built was real and full of people and warm against the winter outside, and also completely exposed to whatever was coming. She did not allow the fear past a certain depth, but she did not pretend it wasn't there. The snow that had been threatening since the 2nd week of December arrived on Christmas Eve with a thoroughness that made all previous snow look like a suggestion. It came in overnight, and by morning there were 14 inches on the ground, and more falling, and the world had reduced itself to the immediate, the barn, the yard, the distance a person could see before the white closed off everything beyond. It also, incidentally, made the question of anyone going anywhere temporarily irrelevant. They were in. Whatever was coming, it was coming to them. Christmas Day was strange and crowded and not at all what any of them had planned, which turned out, in the particular way that unplanned things sometimes do, to be better than anything they'd have arranged. Ruth Patterson was a baker of the serious, committed variety, and she and Savannah worked the kitchen in the careful coordination of 2 women who don't know each other well enough for familiarity, but know each other well enough for respect, turning out enough food to quiet the loudest room. The children were collectively unmanageable in the best possible sense. Cal Garrett got Colt into a conversation about horses that lasted 3 hours, and that Colt appeared to find genuinely engaging in a way that suggested he'd needed someone to talk to who wasn't his father or his brothers. Silas spent the morning doing what he always did: the barn, the animals, the work that didn't stop for holidays. But he came in for dinner and he stayed in, which was its own accommodation. He sat at the crowded table and ate and said little, but his eyes moved around the room with an expression that she caught once, briefly, when he didn't know she was watching. The look of a man confronted with something he hadn't known he wanted. After dinner, when the house had quieted into the specific drowsy peace of too much food and too little sleep, she found him on the porch, in the cold, looking at the snow. She brought him a cup of coffee and stood beside him. "Merry Christmas," she said. He accepted the coffee. After a moment, "House is full." "It is. Louder than I expected. Is that a complaint?" He considered. No. They stood for a while in the cold, and the snow fell, and the valley was entirely invisible beyond the white. "I used to hate this time of year," he said, finally, just stated, not seeking sympathy. "I know," she said. He looked at her sideways. "You know, or you guessed?" "Both." She wrapped both hands around her own cup. "It gets easier, not because it stops meaning what it means, because other things accumulate around it." I was quiet for a long moment. "She would have liked you," he said. And then, like he needed to clarify its limits. I'm not saying that to." "I understand what you're saying," she said. "Thank you." He nodded once and drank his coffee, and they stood in silence, which was, she had come to understand over these months, Silas Boone's most honest form of company. Wunk. The riders came on the 28th of December. She heard the signal first, 2 shots from the McKinney direction, the code they'd established, the sound carrying flat and clear over the frozen ground. She was in the barn. She was at the door before the echo finished. In the yard, Colt was already moving. Cal Garrett was behind him, and McKinney's rider, a boy of 15 who'd ridden hard through the cold, pulled up at the gate and called across. "They're moving. Dozen men, maybe more, coming up the valley road." Silas came out of the house with his rifle and his coat half on. He looked at Savannah. She held his gaze. "Get the children to the root cellar," she said. "Ruth and May can manage it. I'll be out here." "Savannah, I'll be out here," she said again. He looked at her for a second, a long second, containing more than either of them had vocabulary for at that moment. And then he went to direct the men, and she went to find Ruth Patterson. Ruth took the news with the stillness of someone who has feared this for days, and has therefore already lived it. "Children," she said immediately, and her voice brooked nothing. "Emmett, Paul, Henry, inside now. Callie." She looked at May Garrett, who was already moving, the baby held against her chest. They got the children to the root cellar in under 5 minutes. Savannah would think about this later, the efficiency of it, how the practice of living in close quarters had created its own kind of readiness. Emmett went without argument, which meant he understood the severity, which made something tighten hard in her chest. At the cellar door, he turned and looked back at her. "Are you staying up here?" he said. "Yes." He looked at her the way he'd looked at her in the first week, on the porch, with that cautious assessment of a 7-year-old calculating risk. "You'll be careful?" "I will," she said. He went down without another word, and she pulled the cellar door shut over him and turned back to the yard. There were 14 of them. She counted from the porch as they came up the valley road, not charging, not skulking, but riding in the deliberate, unhurried way of men who expect their arrival to be sufficient. They stopped at the gate. Their horses were good horses. The men were weathered, experienced-looking, with the specific economy of movement that comes from people accustomed to making others afraid. The one at the front was older than the rest, mid-40s maybe, with a broad, flat face and pale eyes that moved across the yard, and the house, and the men arranged in it, with the professional assessment of someone pricing an inventory. Rourke. She knew it without being told. On the porch and in the yard. Silas, Colt, Jace, Eli, old enough, she'd determined, Cal Garrett, and 3 men from McKinney's property who'd come with the rider. 8 rifles. Herself on the porch with the rifle Silas had taught her to handle over the past 2 weeks. Not well, she had no pretension about that, but enough to stand there with it and mean it. Ruth Patterson was at the far corner of the porch, positioned with a calm that Savannah found genuinely steadying. She had her rifle up, and she held it the way people hold things they know how to use. Rourke surveyed all of this without hurry. "Boone," he said, not shouting. His voice carried easily, which told her he'd done this before. "I heard you people had a meeting, decided to play at being a community." He looked around the yard again. "Looks like you even invited company." Silas said nothing. He stood at the head of the yard with his rifle at his side. Not raised, not threatening, just there, with the same stillness he brought to everything. It was, she had come to understand, one of his genuine qualities. He did not bluster, and he did not flinch. "I want to speak to whoever's in charge," Rourke said. "Silas." "You're looking at him." Rourke's eyes moved to Savannah on the porch. The briefest assessment, and then a thin, unhurried smile that was not a friendly expression. "I heard different. I heard a woman called this valley to meeting. I heard a woman's been making decisions." He tilted his head. "That true?" She stepped forward to the porch railing before Silas could respond. "I've made some," she said. Clearly, no special heat in it, just a statement. Rourke looked at her with the specific, calculated look of a man who uses other people's underestimations of him as a tool, and who is deciding whether she belongs in that category or another one. "Ma'am," he said, with a politeness that held no politeness in it whatsoever, "you should take yourself inside. This is a conversation between men about business. Nobody needs to get hurt over stubbornness." "Nobody needs to get hurt at all," she said, "but that requires you to turn around." A pause. Behind Rourke, his men had shifted slightly, the small collective motion of people recalibrating the situation they'd ridden into. "You've got 8 rifles," Rourke said, counting without looking. "I've got 14 men and more back on the road." He let that sit. "You're not going to win a fight here." "Maybe not," she said, "but you're not going to win it clean either, and you need to win it clean, or what you're doing out here doesn't work anymore." She held his gaze. She was aware of her own heartbeat, not slow at all, but her voice came out even. "You come into a valley, you make people afraid, they stay afraid, they pay, and you move on. That's the model. But if we fight you here today, and you lose men, which you will, then you're not frightening anymore. You're just a gang with casualties, and the next valley you ride into will know what happened here." Silence. The wind moved across the yard. One of Rourke's horses stamped. He looked at her with those flat, pale eyes. She looked back. She was thinking about Emmett in the root cellar. She was thinking about Silas beside her and the boys, and Ruth Patterson at the corner of the porch. She was thinking about the Garrett baby underground in May Garrett's face when the signal shots had come. She was terrified. She held it absolutely still. "You don't know what you're doing," Rourke said. Quieter now. With a different quality. Not the public performance, but something more direct. Testing her. "I know exactly what I'm doing," she said. "And so do you. You've been in this business long enough to read a room. Read this one." Another silence. Longer. Then, so quietly she almost didn't hear it, Colt said from the yard, "Smoke." She looked where he was looking. To the east, over the ridge. A thin column, then 2, then 3. Riders, coming fast, smoke from torches or signal fires carried ahead of them. McKinney's men, she thought, Parsons. The families they hadn't been able to reach who'd seen the signal shots and responded. Rourke saw it too. She watched his eyes move to the ridge, and then to his men, and then back to her, and she saw in his face the specific arithmetic of a man who has just had the ground shift under his calculation. "This valley's already organized," she said. Not triumphant. She kept triumph entirely out of it, because triumph would have been an invitation to prove something, just factual. "It organized before you got here. That's not going to change after today." The riders on the ridge were visible now. 6, 8, more, coming down toward the valley road with the particular purposeful movement of people who have been waiting to respond to exactly this. Rourke held still for a moment that stretched. Then he moved his horse sideways, not backward, not immediately, a lateral motion that was technically not a retreat but contained the beginning of one, and looked at his men with something communicated in silence, and the group began to shift, gradually. Without hurry, because hurrying would be acknowledgement. "We'll be in this valley again," he said, directed at her specifically. "I expect you'll try," she said. He held her gaze for one more second. Then he turned his horse and rode, and his men rode behind him, and the yard held the particular aftermath silence of a thing that has narrowly not happened. So became aware that her hands were shaking only after she lowered the rifle. She turned away from the road before anyone could see it, and stood with her back to the yard for 3 seconds, breathing through her nose, pressing her hands flat against the porch railing until the shaking passed enough to be manageable. Then she turned back. The riders from the ridge arrived in the yard in a controlled thunder, Parsons at the front, McKinney behind him, and behind them more men than she'd counted on, from properties she hadn't been sure would respond. They pulled up, and the yard filled with voices and horses, and the particular chaotic relief of people who had expected to arrive at something worse. Parsons looked at her from his horse. He looked at the empty road where 14 men had been. He looked back at her. "They left," he said. "They left," she confirmed. He studied her for a moment with the long, weathered gaze of a man who has made accurate assessments of people his whole life and is making one now. Then he said, "You didn't break." "Not where it showed," she said. He nodded slowly, with the specific nod that means, "That's the whole of it, right there." Silas appeared beside her. He hadn't touched her. He was not a demonstrative man, and she hadn't expected him to be. But he stood close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, and for Silas Boone that was its own language. "You all right?" he said. Low, just for her. "Ask me again in an hour," she said. He made the almost sound again, the shadow of something. "You told them to read the room." It seemed relevant. "Where did you—" He stopped. "You weren't afraid." "I was afraid," she said. "I was afraid the entire time." He looked at her. "Couldn't tell." "That was rather the point," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Around them the yard was full and loud, men speaking in the released tension of the aftermath, horses moving, Parsons dismounting, McKinney already in conversation with Cal Garrett. The house behind them was warming. Below ground, Emmett was waiting. "I'm going to get the children," she said. She went to the root cellar and lifted the door and looked down into the dark where 6 children and 2 women sat in the cold, waiting. Emmett was first up the ladder, blinking in the light, and before she could say anything, he had wrapped both arms around her waist and pressed his face into her side and held on with the complete unself-consciousness of a child who has been frightened and has found the person they needed. She put her arms around him. She didn't say anything. She held on. After a moment, he pulled back and looked up at her. "Did they leave?" "They left." He looked at her face with that 7-year-old precision. "Were you scared?" She looked down at him. "Yes," she said. "I was." He seemed to consider this. "But you stayed anyway." "Yes." He nodded, with the grave, particular nod of a child who has just learned something he is going to carry for a long time. Then he looked past her at the full, loud, cold, imperfect yard, at his father and his brothers, and all the strangers who had become, over the course of a winter month, something in between strangers and neighbors. And he said, "Good." They went to find the other children, and she stood at the root cellar door in the winter afternoon, and the valley lay around them, cold and still, and for the moment theirs. The Red Canyon riders did not come back, not that week, not the next. January arrived and settled over Ash Hollow with the serious, permanent cold of a winter that intends to stay, and the valley watched the road and kept its watches and waited, and the men Rourke had led away did not return. Word came eventually, through the particular informal network that Nora Calhoun maintained without ever appearing to maintain it, a trader passing through from the north, a male rider who heard things along his route, that the riders had moved further west, toward territory that hadn't organized against them. Easier pickings. That was always what it came down to with men like that. They were not in the end committed to any particular piece of ground. They were committed to the path of least resistance, and Ash Hollow had stopped being that. Parsons delivered the news on a Tuesday morning in the second week of January, stopping at the Boone Gate on his way back from town. He said it plainly, without ceremony, because he was not a ceremonial man. "Seems like they've moved on," he said. Silas, at the gate, "Seems like. Your wife called it right." He said it to Silas directly, which was the form it needed to take for it to land properly in the valley's social arithmetic, and Savannah, standing near the porch, understood this and did not make anything of it. "She usually does," Silas said, and rode back toward the barn. Parsons looked at her from his horse with the measuring, slightly amused expression he'd been wearing more frequently since December. He touched the brim of his hat and rode back toward his own property, and she went inside to tell Ruth Patterson, who received the news with a long, quiet exhale, and then immediately began figuring out, in practical terms, what the return to her own property would require. The unwinding of the consolidation took longer than the consolidation itself, which is how these things always go. People arrive quickly when there's danger and leave slowly when the danger has passed, because leaving requires agreeing that it is safe to be separate again, and that agreement takes time to trust. The Garretts were the last to go, in the third week of January, loading their wagon in a cold that had moderated slightly, enough to make the 20-minute drive manageable. May Garrett stood in the Boone kitchen on her last morning and looked at Savannah with the direct, slightly raw expression of a woman who doesn't say emotional things easily, but has decided to say one. "I wouldn't have made it through this alone," she said. "Cal wouldn't have either, whatever he'd tell you." "You would have," Savannah said. "You'd have figured something out." "Maybe." May adjusted Callie against her hip. "But not this. Not this." She gestured briefly at the kitchen, the house, the idea of it. "You didn't have to take everyone in. You didn't have to organize any of it. That was your choice and nobody made you." Savannah looked at her. "You'd have done the same." May considered this honestly. "I hope so," she said. "I'm going to try to be the kind of person who would have." They didn't embrace. They were both too practical for that yet, too newly acquainted in the real sense. But May put her free hand on Savannah's arm for a moment, briefly and firmly, in the way that means something that doesn't have a cleaner expression, and then she went out to the wagon. Savannah watched them go from the porch, the wagon moving down the road until the distance swallowed it, and felt the house settle back into its own size, smaller than it had been for a month, quieter, the particular quiet of subtraction. Emmett appeared at her side. He had been seeing Paul Garrett off with the solemnity appropriate to a significant occasion, and he watched the wagon go with a slightly bereft expression. "When will we see them again?" he asked. "Spring, I'd think, when the road is better." She looked down at him. "You could write to Paul if you wanted." He considered this. "I'm not a very good writer yet." "Then it'll be good practice." He seemed to accept this logic. He stood beside her for another moment watching the empty road, and then went inside, and the porch was hers again in the winter quiet. What happened to Ash Hollow after that was not dramatic. It did not announce itself. It accumulated, the way all real change accumulates, in small decisions and repeated choices, and the slow build of trust between people who have been through something together and can no longer entirely pretend they haven't. The first ranchers' meeting, properly organized and held at the trading post in February, was Nora Calhoun's doing. She arranged it with the efficiency of a woman who has been waiting for the valley to arrive at this point for considerably longer than one winter. 11 families sent representatives. Parsons chaired it because the valley trusted Parsons, which Savannah understood and did not work against. Silas sat beside her at the table and participated, asked and answered, brought the specific knowledge of a man who has ranched this ground for decades. And she watched him do it and thought, there he is. That's who he's been under all that closed-off careful management. The meeting established things that should have existed years earlier: a shared signal system, a rotation for road maintenance, an agreement to pool resources in hard seasons rather than each family suffering alone through what collective action could have addressed. None of it was complicated. All of it required that people be in the same room, willing to admit that they needed each other. Collier attended. He sat across the table from Savannah with the expression of a man who has lost an argument he is not ready to fully concede, and said little. She did not press him. Winning an argument with a man like Collier required not winning it at all. It required waiting for him to arrive at the position himself, which he eventually would, when enough time and enough evidence made it the only position that made sense. She had patience for that. She had learned patience from the first weeks in this house, which had required it in quantities she hadn't known she possessed. After the meeting, Silas rode home beside her in the thin February light, both of them wrapped against the cold, the horses moving at an easy pace. I was quiet for a long stretch, his usual mode of processing, and then he said, without looking at her, "My father would have hated that meeting." Because of the cooperation? Because of admitting that any single operation needed the others. He was thoughtful, not bitter, working something out. He believed in the independent man, self-sufficient, needed nobody. Was he happy? She asked. Straightforwardly, no softness or hardness to it. Silas considered this for a genuinely long time, long enough that the horses had covered another quarter-mile before he answered. "No," he said, "I don't think he was." She nodded. She did not extrapolate from that, did not draw the line between his father and himself out loud. She trusted him to draw it himself, in his own time, which he was clearly in the process of doing. The meeting was good, he said, finally. It was the right thing. It was, she agreed. He glanced at her sideways. You're not going to say I told you so? No. Why not? Because you know, she said, and because it matters more that you know it than that I say it. He looked at her. The winter light was the pale, clear kind that comes when the clouds thin out and the cold is still absolute but the sun is returning, and in it his face was more open than she'd ever seen it. Not transformed, not softened into something easier, but present. Actually there. I have not been an easy man to marry, he said. No, she agreed. You haven't. He almost laughed. It was the closest she'd seen him come to it, a sound that was more than a breath and less than the full thing, somewhere in between, like a muscle that had forgotten how to do it and was beginning to remember. Most women would have softened that. I'm not most women. No, he said. You're not. They rode the rest of the way home in silence, that was, by now, the kind they'd both learned to live in. Not the silence of two people who have nothing to say, but the particular quiet of two people who have said enough hard things that the space between words has become, finally, somewhere they can both rest. February broke cold and then colder, and March came in with the particular stubbornness of a winter that doesn't know when it's over, 2 steps forward and 1 step of ice and wind back. But there was light in it, a different quality of light than January, a suggestion of something on the other side of all this cold. The boys were different by March, not unrecognizable. They were still who they'd always been, still carrying the particular shapes that grief and hardship and years of managed survival had pressed into them. But the shapes were changing, incrementally, the way shapes change when pressure shifts. Colt had begun, for the first time since Savannah had arrived, to seem occasionally his actual age. It happened in small moments, laughing at something Sam did at the table, the kind of unreserved laugh that has no management in it. Spending an afternoon with Cal Garrett talking about horses for the pure pleasure of talking about horses, not because there was a problem to solve. Asking Savannah one evening, with a casualness that cost him something, whether she thought the farrier work was worth pursuing properly, whether he might learn the trade more formally. Yes, she said immediately. You'd be good at it. He looked at his hands. They were already the hands of someone who worked with them seriously. I don't want to just run the ranch, he said, carefully, like he was saying something he'd been turning over for a long time. I want to... There should be something that's mine, not just inherited. Then do it, she said. The ranch isn't going anywhere. You have time to build something alongside it. He nodded slowly. The nod of someone giving themselves permission for something they'd been waiting for someone to say was permissible. Jace stopped hiding the money. It happened quietly. He simply brought what he'd been earning to the kitchen table one evening and set it down and said to Savannah matter-of-factly, $6 from the Holt job, 2 from deliveries. He paused. I'd like to keep doing the farrier work if that's all right, but I don't want to hide it anymore. It was always all right, she said. The hiding was never necessary. He looked at the money on the table. I know that now. A pause. I think I knew it before, actually. I think hiding it was easier than having the conversation about why it existed. She looked at him. He was 17 and had more self-awareness than most men twice his age, which was its own kind of burden and also its own kind of gift. Put it in the household account, she said, and the next time you take work, tell your father first. He nodded. He picked up the money and put it in the tin where she kept the household funds and went back upstairs, and that was the end of the secret and the beginning of something more honest, which was all any secret needed when it finally came into the light. Eli took longer. He was 14 and had compressed himself so thoroughly over 2 years of unprocessed grief that decompressing was not a single event, but a long, irregular process with setbacks. A week of openness followed by 3 days of the old sealed withdrawal, and then something would shift again. She did not push him. She learned to read the difference between the withdrawal that needed space and the withdrawal that needed a quiet presence nearby, and she calibrated accordingly. How was, she thought, going to be fine? Not soon, and not without more hard work, but fine in the durable sense. The kind of fine that comes from having actually dealt with something rather than routed around it. Sam started talking. Not broadly, not suddenly a different boy, but he had apparently decided that words were occasionally worth the risk, and he began to offer them in small doses. Observations at dinner. A question for Colt about something he'd been wondering. A comment to Savannah, one morning, while she was making the cornbread. I looked at Mama's recipe box, he said. Not looking at her, looking at the stove. The handwriting is nice? It is, she said. She was a good cook? I'd guess so, from the recipes. She paused. The ones you boys remember most. The ones you've mentioned. They're the kind people make when they cook with love and not just necessity. He was quiet for a moment. That's a good way to describe it, he said, and went back to whatever he'd been doing. She stood at the stove and let the smallness of that moment have its full weight, because small moments were where everything real lived, and she had learned, these months, not to overlook them. Henry stopped pretending everything was fine all the time, which turned out to mean that he had considerable opinions about considerable things, held with a passion entirely disproportionate to his 10 years and completely authentic to who he actually was. He argued with Sam about everything. He argued with Eli about less but more intensely. He had strong views on the correct way to mend a fence, the correct temperature for cornbread, and the correct handling of a particular horse named Bo, who he had decided was misunderstood by the entire family and required his specific advocacy. How was Savannah thought going to be a force when he was grown? He was already exhausting, which was the same thing at a smaller scale. Spring arrived in the third week of March. Not grandly, not all at once, but the way spring arrives in places that have earned it. Tentatively at first, a few days of melt and mud, then a cold snap that made everyone think they'd imagined it, and then more warmth, persistent and genuine. Until one morning the frost was gone and the ground was soft, and there were things growing at the edge of the kitchen garden that had not been asked to grow, but had decided to anyway. Savannah stood in the garden on the first real spring morning and assessed what winter had left and what it hadn't. The turnip rows were gone. The herb patch had survived, partly. The hardier things, the ones that had deep enough roots to wait out the cold. She walked the rows in her work boots, making notes in her head, planning the season's planting with the same methodical attention she'd brought to the pantry inventory on her first week, and felt the difference between those two moments as something almost physical. The woman who had sat at the kitchen table in October counting what was there, and finding it insufficient, was the same woman, carrying the same essential character, but standing in different ground. She had not fixed the Boone family. She wanted to be clear with herself about this, because the temptation to organize a neater story about it was real, and she distrusted neat stories. She had not arrived and healed anyone. People don't heal each other that way. They create conditions in which healing becomes possible, and then the healing happens, or it doesn't, in its own time, in its own shape, and it leaves marks regardless and is never quite complete. What she had done was stay. That was the core of it. She had stayed when staying was hard, and she had spoken when speaking was risky, and she had worked without waiting to be asked, and she had pushed against things that needed pushing and given space to things that needed space. None of this had been natural or easy. She had guessed wrong sometimes. She could name the moments, would not catalog them here, but she knew them. She had misjudged Silas twice, in ways that had cost them time and had to be walked back. She had pushed Eli too directly once, and he'd shut down for 5 days, and she'd had to figure out, without a manual, how to approach a grieving teenager who didn't yet know he was grieving. She had, in short, been a person navigating a difficult situation with the limited instruments available to a person. And so had all of them. And somehow, out of all that imperfect navigation, something had been built that hadn't been there before. She was still thinking about this when she heard Emmett in the yard, calling her name. She went around to the front and found him standing at the gate with the expression of someone who has been waiting to say something and has decided the moment has arrived. Papa wants everyone in the kitchen, he said. She looked at him. Now? He said for supper. Emmett paused. He said he has something to say. She didn't ask what. She went inside. Well, Silas had made supper himself. This was sufficiently unusual that it arranged the boys in the kitchen with a collective attention that was both amused and slightly wary. Silas at the stove was not a common sight, and the results of his cooking were historically variable, which was a diplomatic way of saying that the last time he'd attempted it without supervision, the cornmeal had been inedible, and even the dog had been skeptical. What he'd made was, in fact, reasonable. A stew that had been going since the afternoon, with the bread Savannah had baked that morning, and the remains of a jar of peach preserve that had appeared from somewhere. The boys sat. Savannah sat. Silas brought the pot to the table himself and set it down and sat at the head and looked around at his family. All 6 boys, Savannah at the other end, the kitchen warm with the stove and the lengthening evening light coming through the window. I was not comfortable. He was doing it anyway, which by now she understood was his highest form of sincerity. I want to say something, he said. I'm going to say it badly, probably. I want you to know I mean it regardless. Nobody spoke. Emmett had gone very still in the way he went still when something important was happening, and he wanted to make sure he didn't miss it. I was not... Silas stopped, started again. This family went through something after your mother died. He looked at the table, then made himself look up. At Colt, at Jace, at each of them in turn. I didn't handle it well. I handled the ranch. I handled the work. I did not handle the rest of it, and the rest of it mattered, and all of you paid for that in ways I'm still understanding the full accounting of. The kitchen was very quiet. The stew settled in its pot. I'm not going to say it won't happen again, because I don't fully trust myself on that, and I'd rather be honest than promising. A pause. But I'm aware of it now in a way I wasn't before, and that's... He looked briefly at Savannah. That's not something that happened by itself. She met his gaze and held it and said nothing, because nothing was what this moment needed from her. He looked back at his boys. Colt, you kept this ranch running when I wasn't running it. That's not a debt I can repay, but I want you to know I see it. You hear me? Colt's jaw was tight. He nodded once. Jace? The same. Silas said it with the same directness. No ceremony, no inflation. You fed your brothers when I wasn't paying close enough attention to what was needed. It took more than it should have from someone your age. Jace looked at his father. He said nothing. His expression was not forgiving in a simple way. It was something more complicated and more honest than simple forgiveness. The expression of someone who is absorbing a thing they've needed to hear for a long time and is still in the process of letting it land. Eli. He held his middle son's gaze. I owe you more talking than I gave you. I don't know if that gets easier for me, but I intend to try. Eli looked at his father and something in his face moved. He pressed his mouth together and nodded and looked at the table. And it was the most emotion she'd seen him show in 5 months, which meant it was real. Silas looked at Sam, at Henry, at Emmett. You 3, he said, and his voice had changed slightly. Not softer exactly, but with something underneath it that was wearing the surface thin. You 3 have been... He stopped. I'm going to do better, he said. It came out plainly, without ornament, and was better for it. Emmett, across the table, said, Okay, Papa, just that. 2 words, delivered with the complete equanimity of a 7-year-old who has decided to accept an apology and move forward and sees no reason to make a production of it. There was a brief, fragile silence, and then Colt made a sound, and then Jace, and then the kitchen broke into the slightly chaotic, half-embarrassed, completely genuine sound of a family that is laughing a little because the alternative is crying, and they have collectively decided that laughing is the better option, and the two were honestly pretty close to each other anyway. Silas reached across the table and picked up the ladle and served the stew, and it was, by a reasonable margin, the best supper they'd eaten since October. Not because the cooking was exceptional, but because of what had been said in the kitchen before they started eating. Afterward, when the boys had dispersed and the kitchen was quiet, Silas stayed at the table. Savannah was washing up. He sat with his hands around his empty cup and looked at the table and then looked at her. I have something to say to you too, he said. She turned. You arrived in September, he said, and I gave you very little welcome, very little ease. I left you to find your way in a household that was not functioning, and I told myself that was what you'd agreed to, and that was fair. It was what I agreed to, she said. It wasn't fair, he said. Fair would have been. I could have done more. I didn't, because it was easier to focus on the ranch than to look at what the house needed. And what the house needed was the same thing the ranch needed. Someone paying attention to the actual condition of things. He looked at her directly. You paid attention. You made things better. Not because anyone asked you to. You just did it. She was quiet for a moment. I did it because I live here, she said. That's all. It's not all. He set the cup down. I know what I hired you for. I know what I put in that letter. Not looking for romance, looking for partnership. He paused. I wrote that to protect myself because I'd made the mistake of... He stopped. Because I didn't want to be the kind of fool who marries a stranger and has expectations about it. He looked at the table. I have, in fact, developed some expectations. She looked at him. What kind? He met her eyes. The kind that involved this being a real marriage, he said. Not the arrangement I advertised. If that's... He stopped. The most uncertain she'd ever seen him look. Not the professional uncertainty of a man assessing a situation, but the personal kind, the kind that costs something. If that's something you're open to. The kitchen was very still. She had come here in September with nothing but a worn bag and the cold knowledge that staying in Kansas City meant disappearing. She had not come here for this. She had not expected this. She had not, in her more honest moments, allowed herself to want it, because wanting things that weren't certain had seemed like a luxury she couldn't afford. She looked at Silas Boone, this difficult, private, proud, slowly changing man who had made supper and said hard things to his sons, and was now looking at her with something undefended in his face. And she thought, he is not easy, and he will not become easy, and neither will this, and I knew that in October, and I'm still here. Yes, she said, that's something I'm open to. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded, with the particular nod that meant the matter was settled, and he intended to honor it, which from Silas Boone was as binding as anything spoken in a church. Good, he said, and then, more quietly, good. Spring came properly in April, in the way the valley had been working toward since the first tentative thaw. The kitchen garden was planted, the full version, not the rescued remnants of last autumn. The land was soft and workable, and the cattle were healthy, and the ranch, which had been bleeding slowly for 2 years before Savannah arrived, had found a footing that was not comfortable yet, but was solid. Real solid, not the performed solidity of a man telling himself things were fine. Colt had begun his formal apprenticeship with a farrier in the next town over, riding out 2 days a week, and coming back with the specific aliveness of someone doing work that has chosen them as much as they've chosen it. He still ran the ranch. He always would, probably. It was in him too deep to come out. But there was something else in him now, too, something that was his in a different way. Jace was working openly, talking openly, and had, in a development that Savannah considered one of the more satisfying of the winter, developed a friendship with the Garrett boy that seemed to be doing both of them considerable good. Eli had started keeping a journal. She'd noticed it by accident, a worn notebook he tucked quickly under his mattress when she knocked on his doorframe, and she hadn't mentioned it and never would. Some things needed to stay private to stay real. She was just glad it existed. Sam was building something in the barn. She didn't know what. He went out there with tools and wood and returned looking satisfied in a way he hadn't before, and she respected the privacy of the project enough not to ask, though Emmett had reported that it was a box for keeping important things, which she chose to interpret broadly and generously. Henry's views on the horse named Bo had been substantially validated when Bo turned out to have an untreated hoof issue that, once addressed, made the horse considerably more manageable, a development that Henry accepted with the magnanimity of someone who had always known they were right and was prepared to be gracious about it. Emmett had gotten a letter from Paul Garrett. He'd shown it to Savannah first before anyone else, as if she were the appropriate first reader of important documents, and she'd read it and declared it an excellent letter, which it was. A 6-year-old's letter, uneven and earnest, and Emmett had taken it back and read it 6 more times, and then carefully put it in the box Sam had built. She didn't know he'd put it there until Sam told her quietly, a week later. Emmett keeps his important things in my box now. He paused. I said he could. She looked at him. 12 years old, with Clara Boone's careful handwriting in his memory and his own reserved tenderness. That was generous of you, she said. He shrugged, in the way of someone for whom the thing was obvious, and the generosity requires no acknowledgement. He needed somewhere to put them, he said simply. The supper table in April was the same table it had been in September. The same wood, the same chairs, the same kitchen, with the same window looking out at the same land. But it held different things now, not perfect things. Imperfect, complicated, occasionally frustrating, sometimes loud and sometimes not loud enough things. Real things. Silas sat at the head and filled his cup and held it up, and the boys looked at him with the slight surprise of men who don't associate their father with gestures of this kind. To the valley, he said. Colt raised his cup. Then Jace. Then down the line, Eli, Sam, Henry, Emmett holding his tin cup with both hands, and the gravity of someone participating in something he understands to be significant. Savannah raised hers. Silas looked at her across the table. He had, over the winter and into the spring, become someone she was beginning to know. Actually know, in the slow way you come to know difficult things, without the benefit of simplicity, but with the benefit of depth. He was still not easy. He was still more silence than speech. He still sometimes withdrew to places she couldn't follow, and she had stopped trying to follow him and started waiting instead, and he almost always came back. And to the woman, he said, who told this valley to read the room. He paused. And who was right about most things, and was honest about the ones she wasn't, and stayed through all of it. He looked at her steadily. I don't have a better word for what you are to this family than the right one. So I'll just say it. The table was very quiet. Even Henry was still. Heart, he said. You're the heart of it. She held his gaze. The kitchen was warm and full, and outside the spring evening was coming in over the land that had been hard and cold, and was now soft and beginning. She thought about Kansas City and the rented room and the rain on the window and the decision she'd made with a letter in her hand and a cold cup of coffee beside her. She thought about how little she'd expected then and how much, how improbably, imperfectly much, she'd found. She did not cry. She was not, temperamentally, a woman who cried easily, and she had no intention of starting at the supper table. But she raised her cup and held it toward him, and he held his toward her, and around the table 6 boys did the same. Emmett with maximum solemnity, Henry with mild fidgeting, the older ones with the quiet weight of young men who know what they're honoring and why. To the ranch, she said, to all of us. They drank. And then Emmett knocked his cup over, which he did on a fairly regular basis, and showed no signs of improving, and the moment broke into the ordinary chaos of someone cleaning up a spill, while someone else laughed and someone else complained about their sleeve, and the kitchen was loud and imperfect and real and warm. Outside, the last light moved across the land. Silas Boone had built his life on, and nearly lost, and was, slowly and without drama, building again. The grass was green where it had been frozen. The fences were straight where they'd been broken. And in the kitchen of the house, at the center of it all, a woman who had arrived carrying only loss and necessity sat at a table full of people who had not expected her and could not now imagine doing without her, and felt the strange, durable, difficult thing that she had stopped being afraid to call by its name. She was home. Not because the hard parts were over, they weren't, and they wouldn't be, because that is not how homes work, or how people work, or how any of it works. But because she had learned, somewhere between September and April, that home is not a place you find already made for you. It's a thing you build in the gaps between people, in the space opened by telling the truth, and staying when staying is hard, and choosing, again and again, the people in front of you over the easier thing. She had chosen, and they had chosen her back. And in Ash Hollow, in the spring of a year that had asked more of everyone than any of them had planned for, that was enough. It was in fact more than enough. It was everything.